Overclocks. Now, would you believe me if I told you there was a time before overclocks? A time before weapons were really the weapons that they are today. And you know what I can say about that time? It was fine. You know, we didn't realise how much of an impact overclocks would make. We didn't realise how much they were something that we needed in the future of Deep Rock Galactic. But then they came along, and now we find ourselves with our most recent update, Season 5, having added a lot more new overclocks, or rather 12. 13 technically in total if you count a rework, which I think you can. However, that rework will not be covered in this video. And this is basically going to be me going through every overclock in Season 5 and providing every balance change that I can think of that I think could be made to them. Now, why am I doing this, you may ask? Well, first of all, I've wanted to do a video like this for a very long time, and I think it's about the right time to do it. We're not going to be getting any major updates for Deep Rock for a very long time, or at least that depends on when you're watching this video, of course. If you're watching this around Season 6, then lucky you. But if you're watching it around the time that it comes out, it's going to be a while. But the one thing that I think might happen is balance changes. I certainly know certain things. Let's say a certain overclock called Burst Fire might have some changes in the can that a certain game designer wants to get into the game. But as of yet, that has not happened. Anyway, first of all, let's do a little bit of brief history about overclocks. Now, like I said, overclocks weren't in the game from the start. They were actually introduced in Update 25, Endgame Part 1, which was Part 1. If you were to put the two updates together, you would get what was easily the biggest update. Excuse me. They are only beaten out by Season 1 because it's a Part 1 and a Part 2. Season 1 beats one of the individual parts, I suppose, but then you think about the fact that this update introduced deep dives and overclocks and a lot more other stuff. I think it did introduce machine events. Oh no, I think Part 2 introduced machine events, and then there was a follow-up update that added the Omen as well, because even the Omen was left out. So you can kind of say there were actually 3 parts to it. Anyway, so we've had overclock since update 25, and then you come to update 35, Season 1. This is the first time we actually got new overclocks. Now, there were certain changes, I think possibly even reworks that could be considered relatively new overclocks in between update 25 and update 35, but it was only with getting the new weapons in Season 1, and then of course that followed up in Season 2 with the new secondary weapons, that we actually got overclocks that we didn't have before, which was no surprise given that they were on weapons that we didn't have before. But something that was sort of indicated through the roadmaps leading up to Season 1 was that with the addition of new weapons, the fact that they would bring their own new overclocks would also mean that they were very likely to add new overclocks for the older weapons as well. So the idea of the weapons that we already had before the Season 1 and 2 lot getting new overclocks had sort of been in the zeitgeist since before Season 1. And of course it didn't happen with Season 1, it didn't happen with Season 2 or Season 3. Season 4, it replaced a couple. It replaced manual guidance cutoff on the Hurricane with rocket barrage. It replaced double barrel on the boomstick with double barrel, but it was essentially a new overclock. It was only come Season 5 that Ghost Ship finally saw fit to finally give us some brand new overclocks, one each for every primary weapon, and I think it's fair to say that they mostly knocked it out of the park. Every overclock brings significant changes to the weapon, even if they don't necessarily add new mechanics, if they don't add status effects, all that exciting stuff. Even if they don't, they still very much so change the feel of the weapon, and I think that's what's important. However, on the other side of things, I think a number of them do fall short, and even then, there are a lot of changes I can think of for even the better ones that I think could go a long way to improving them. And I want to really, get out there an important detail, which is I'm not a developer, and I'm also not making claims that I believe are objective. This is a very, very biased video, and I was supposed to save that for just a few moments down the line, because what I actually want to do first is give everyone a bit of a recap on all of the overclocks that were added in Season 5. And this is also a bit of a test for me to remember all of their names. So without further ado, going in classic barrel vision order of engineer through gunner, through driller, through scout, here they are, because they don't have the names attached to them on this slide. So we have pump action for the Warthog, Hyperalloy assembly for the Stubby, and Smart Trigger operating system trademark for the Smart Rifle. Rotary overdrive for the Minigun, Mortar rounds for the Thunderhead, and cluster charges for the Hurricane. Scorching Tide for the Flamethrower, Crystal Nucleation for the Cryo Cannon, and Combustive Goo Mix for the Sludge Pump. And of course, Burst Fire for the GK2, Mark for Death for the M1000, and Conductive Thermals for the Drak 25 Plasma Carbine. So there they all are, and well, as you can see, it almost looks more, it looks like there's more than 12 there almost, doesn't it? Anyway, another bit of groundwork I need to lay is the most important through line of all of these suggestions that I'm going to be making. And that sort of are, there's two things there. There are, first of all, the categories into which I'm going to be splitting balance changes. There are actually going to be 4 types of changes I'm going to be making. The first of which are basically just tweaks. So it's either small buffs, small nerfs, or very minor mechanical changes. These aren't always necessarily minor. If, say, the only thing that I'm changing is a mechanical change, it could be fairly substantial. And these usually boil down to very small changes that can go a long way to usually accessing certain breakpoints, and we'll get to breakpoints in just a moment. The other category, or the second category, is of course buffs, which will be exclusively buffs, as you might expect, and these can include minor mechanical changes, and when appropriate can also include a category change. As far as I know, I don't think any of the tweaks involve category changes, but all of the other kinds do, the third of which being a rework. I was actually expecting it to say nerfs next, because I didn't. Well, that tells you how well planned this is. Although I will say, even if you don't think this has been well planned, it's about 10 times better planned than any other Barrel Vision video. So, anyway, so reworks are the most important, not the most common. I would say tweaks and buffs roundabouts being the most common. Probably tweaks, but reworks are the most important because the rework can include any range of minor to major buffs, major to minor category changes, or, well, mechanical changes, or category changes. But usually there is an element of all 3 of these things: buffs, nerfs, and mechanical changes. These often also entail a name change as well, which is something you'll see, where I believe that what I'm proposing is better, basically, either to be a completely renewed overclock or a completely new overclock. So I want to acknowledge that the reworks, in some cases, are kind of my way of suggesting new overclocks, but they're sort of inspired by the overclock that we're discussing. Anyway, of course, the final category is nerfs, which is by far the smallest number of instances in the video. It's actually only 2 nerfs. These are, of course, exclusively nerfs, same as buffs, though, in every other way. And those are the categories. There is actually one other sort of special category. It's not actually labelled separately on the slides themselves, but there is one type of change that does crop up twice that you'll see later on that is sort of quite different. It's quite different in terms of how it plays with the nature of overclocks. And I know it sounds a little bit weird, but you'll see that at some point and you'll understand when you do. Anyway, the other half of the most important groundwork to lay is something that I sort of indicated when I mentioned breakpoints. And so we have to talk about our favourite little friend, the Glyphid Grunt. So the Glyphid Grunt is, of course, the most common enemy in the game. And I'm not going to go through all of the information that's on the screen, but what you do need to know is how we're going to be approaching this. So first of all, the Grunt is the most unchanging in terms of health, basically. It has 108 hit points on hazard levels 4 and 5, and tough enemies factor 1. And this is with any number of players as well. So it's by far the most common enemy in proportion to its how much its health stays the same. So much so that I think the 108 HP Grunt, I think, is probably the most commonly encountered enemy in the game, because I think Hazard 4 is the most played. Either way, this is also letting you know that I'm approaching this from a Hazard 5 perspective, which I will talk a little bit about more in just a second as well. Of course, the Grunts attack in large numbers in swarms and pressure waves, but they also can spawn in sort of smaller groups as well. But basically, the point of the Grunt and why I'm bringing him up specifically is because the grunt represents the most important breakpoint in the game. And a breakpoint is literally just like a threshold at which your weapon is capable of killing the grunt. So the number of shots, or if it's perhaps a one shot, and that breakpoint is changed by taking one upgrade that takes the weapon from not being able to one-shot a grunt to being able to one-shot it. That's kind of what a breakpoint is. So this 108 hit points on the Glyphid Grunt is the most commonly referenced thing to justify some of the changes I'm proposing in the video. And there are a couple of instances. I think Praetorians come up a couple times, as do other enemies in more specific scenarios, but the Glyphid Grunt is the through line that sort of helps me render the reasonings in your heads as to why these changes should be made, because everyone understands the grunt, everyone knows that they're the enemy that they face the most. So it's kind of the thing, whether you're thinking about it or not, it's kind of the thing you're subconsciously considering every time you make a change to your weapon in the equipment terminal. So the Glyphid Grunt is far and beyond the most important enemy in the game, and even more so the most important enemy for the purposes of this video, as you'll come to see. Anyway, like I said, this video is entirely based around a Hazard 5 perspective. That's because I play exclusively on Hazard 5, as do many people sort of at my level of playtime, including, of course, the other half of the channel, one Mr. Tyler, when he does play. But I also do typically play with Hazard 5 Plus, where I have enemy frequency turned up by 1. That's not too relevant. The point is, I play on Hazard 5 exclusively, and that is to say, this video is extremely biased. There are a number of suggestions, and overall the entire video is informed by sort of threads that I've put out into the ether on both YouTube and Reddit, where people have suggested things that I've sort of taken into account, and these sort of inform a lot of the general changes, but there are also entire sort of suggestions, not reworks I don't think, but there are entire suggestions completely formed around an idea given to me by someone. But on the whole, this is extremely biased because, you know, if you were to look at the actual feedback, it would indicate that aside from some special exceptions like burst fire, the Season 5 overclocks were received easily very positively. And I think that's completely fair, but that doesn't stop me from sort of overthinking things and conjuring up dozens upon dozens of different changes that I think could actually improve them. So apologies for being opinionated, but I'm not here to be objective, I'm here to be me, and what my brain kind of tells me is objective, rather than what I know from any kind of actual substantiated knowledge. But of course, it is also based very much so in numbers and sort of a very, I guess, long developed understanding of the game. And of course, like I said, numbers. A lot of the changes are based on the Hazard 5 grunt breakpoint, or the Hazard 4 and 5 grunt breakpoint, and a number of others. So numbers are heavily considered, but that does not make me an expert. Anyway, so if anyone has seen any of our older videos, like the Overclock workshops, you're going to be very familiar with the format that this is going to take, because every individual slide that covers an overclock for all the different changes is going to be presented pretty much exactly like how those overclocks looked in those videos. So if you've seen those videos, you kind of know what you're in for. And of course, if you've watched any Battle Vision video that involves tackling categories of things on a class basis, you know that we go in a very particular order. And as usual, that order is going to start with the one and only, my main, the engineer.
One platform, ready to use.
So like I said, the engineer is my main, and while honestly I could probably say that I actually prefer playing gunner, and they are pretty close in terms of playtime, the engineer is the character, or the class I've played the most. It's the first one that I picked, and engineers and sort of mainly sentry turrets are something that's always close to my heart. It's kind of just where my brain and heart sort of guides me in any sort of class-based thing, except Overwatch actually. But Marvel Rivals, I mean look, I don't give a shit about Namor, but now I do. Anyway, the point is, engineer is kind of my ride or die. I mean, he's my mascot for the channel, I understand him inside and out, and as a result, I can honestly say that when it comes to Season 5 and the addition of the new Overclocks, he probably did the worst. I wouldn't say he came out looking the worst, although that's a bit more abstract. I wouldn't say anyone really came out looking bad, but if you discount the rework to turret arc, which you should for these purposes because it's not a brand new overclock, it's a rework, although it does add a substantial changes to that overclock and it's got a different name as well, I acknowledge that, but it's not a new overclock. If we take purely the new ones, I think he did the worst, and I think that is actually owed to the next overclock we're going to be talking about, not the next one, the one after the next one. The next one is the first one, which is of course pump action. And now, using pump action, it usually goes a little bit like this. So as you can see, pump action is kind of great. It's a really, really strong overclock. It's not interesting. And that's not necessarily a shame. Well, it's a shame in the sense of the Warthog still only has 6 overclocks. It started with 5 going into Season 5, and now it only has 6. Unlike some weapons, which are now at 8. I was of the mind that the Warthog straight up should have gotten 2 overclocks, because I think that number is just a little bit too low. Once all the weapons get a new overclock, which we're assuming that the secondaries will get them in Season 6, obviously that's not soon, but that's not the point. If it's still only 1 per, which it should be overall, but if it's still only 1 per, then both the Zhukovs and the Warthog will be the only weapons in the game with just 6 overclocks, and I don't see why that should be. And I don't begrudge pump action, but I do feel that there is still an opening in the Warthog for a much more interesting overclock. And one of the ideas I'm going to be proposing for the pump action does actually lend itself to that idea a little bit, because while pump action is first and foremost a simple damage dealer and it's very good at dealing damage, my goodness, it's very satisfying, it's very ammo efficient, and it does definitely change the feel of the weapon. It does come with this sort of ambiguous blow-through effect. I mean, I would say dubious really as to what the point is. It does still enhance the strength of the weapon. It's definitely a nice bonus to have, but it's not like pump action is a good crowd clearer. Now, where you could do well is combining pump action with something that isn't inherently one either. So 2 weapons that are kind of just powerful, but not particularly directed, or don't have a particularly strong direction as far as their role goes. Using pump action with a weapon alongside a weapon like that, I would say sort of a heavy hitting grenade launcher, or maybe something like spinning death on the bridge cutter, is actually quite a powerful combo, because both of them are just kind of just strong, but don't necessarily excel. But of course, speccing into damage on the pump action definitely is strong, and that's kind of what our first tweak lends itself to, and that is our very first overclock change, is a tweak to pump action. Now you're going to notice that basically what's been done here is the damage has been increased even further. It's actually gone up by 2 damage and 1 pellets, although there has also been a reload time penalty added onto it. But the idea behind this is quite simple. I mean, the description kind of sells it. I mean, actually, that's not a description. So what these are, these little bits of text below the overclock, like points, are kind of just explanations of sort of more minute details that maybe need to be presented or highlighted. So in this case, and I'd say the first one is the more prominent one, which is the fact that it meets the slasher breakpoint as long as you take armor breaking. Now this is going to be quite a common theme actually, is changes to overclocks that make them hit a specific breakpoint under very specific conditions, because I think that in general I'd be taking a bit of a step too far by suggesting things that change the breakpoints constantly. In fact, there is actually one of the other suggestions for this, for pump action, is that kind of thing, and I will be sure to point it out when it happens. But usually the breakpoints that are suggested are achieved through very specific upgrades, even beyond sort of the changes that I'm proposing that would make the breakpoint accessible. So you could, as long as all of your shots hit all of the pellets, and and you had the armor breaking mod equipped, I believe this means that you don't need to take increased damage, you just need the armor breaking. You can one-shot a slasher, which I think is actually a breakpoint that very few weapons really care for. I'm pretty sure the main one that achieves this is electrocuting focus shots on the M1000. But of course, the Warthog being a shotgun is a very different weapon to that, and it also says that it reduces the Praetorian breakpoint by roughly 1 shot. I think this makes it much more consistent to kill a Praetorian within 1 magazine, which I think is something that pump action should be able to do. And now, I actually, when I think about it, I probably should have put in a Praetorian diagram as well, because the Praetorian is actually quite important to talk about. Not inherently because of the armor, and I will say I'm fairly confident that this breakpoint relies on armor breaking as well. Maybe damage as well. I'm not sure about the damage still. Can't say. Maybe someone could, mod these changes in. That'd be great. I don't have the means to do that, unsurprisingly. But what's interesting about the Praetorian and why I can sort of measure this breakpoint quite accurately is because if you didn't know, weak points don't operate in a lateral manner. They aren't all the same. There's usually 3 main types of weak points, and the best examples of those weak points are, so all the grunts have a 2 times weak point, all of the Mactera I think have 3 times weak points, and Praetorians and Oppressors have 1 times weak points. Now what this really means is what a weak point is simply an exposed bit of flesh that you get weak point bonuses from if your weapon has them. And what I mean by that is, when it comes to the Praetorian and the Oppressor having a 1 times weak point, that means that you only actually deal more damage than your weapon says it deals to them if you have a weak point bonus in the weapon. When it comes to things with a 2 times weak point like Grunts, or a 3 times weak point like Macteras, direct damage will always deal 2 or 3 times the damage to them. But a Praetorian or an Oppressor, it will only deal the damage that it says on the weapon, and then the bonus comes from, like I said, if you have an upgrade for it or a built-in bonus. The Warthog has neither. It does have a weak point bonus in the form of an Overclock, magnetic pellet alignment, but it doesn't have an upgrade and it does not have a built-in weak point multiplier, which means that when it comes to Praetorian's flesh, you deal the same damage to its flesh as you deal to its weak point, which means as long as you take armor breaking, you deal the same amount of damage to the Praetorian wherever you shoot it, which makes this breakpoint valid, because it means you don't have to think about the weak point, basically. You do if you want to stun it, but if you don't, you can just shoot it anywhere and it should go down in a magazine, or less than a magazine, I suppose. So that's a simple tweak. Of course, it is really only making the gun stronger, or making the overclock stronger, but there is a small reload time penalty included just for good measure. But really, where I think we're getting away with this, or where I think I'm getting away with this, I suppose, is that it already does so much damage that I think pushing it up a bit for the express purpose of meeting these specific breakpoints isn't necessarily going too far. Of course, it will have a bit of a difference in sort of a broader sense, in more niche, sort of ill-defined scenarios, like maybe it's a difference between finishing off a dreadnought or not finishing it off. I acknowledge that that could happen, but I think on principle I'm tweaking the weapon to meet certain breakpoints that aren't like offensive, don't make it offensively overpowered. Speaking of offensively overpowered, I'd like to introduce to you our first rework, Wrecker, and play the clip. So what you just saw was a game called RoboQuest. It's going to come up a lot during this video actually, because a number of the references for the rework specifically are actually drawn from RoboQuest. It's a game that's just filled to the brim with awesome weapons and unique mechanics I would love to see Rocore specifically draw on, because as it stands, RoboQuest is the best roguelike FPS I've ever played, and ideally Rocore will take that crown with ease, but I believe that it definitely needs to take some inspiration from RoboQuest to achieve this. Anyway, so Wrecker, so first of all, there's the information. I would like to say first of all, this is actually based on an old idea that actually predates the RoboQuest mechanic. So let's just kind of read through what it does. So what stayed the same is that we get +5 damage and +2 pellets. Additionally, the ammo penalties to the maximum ammo in the magazine size are almost the same. The max ammo has been tweaked slightly, but in terms of what's new, we have this new positive mechanic, which is that each enemy struck by a pellet takes full damage. Now, full damage, as it says there, is actually just the damage times the pellet count. which I don't have the numbers for to hand, but that's not a hard thing to fix. Okay, the information is being retrieved. When you take pump action but with no modifications, the total damage is still 120. Which, in case you didn't know, is, well, actually you should know now after we've been through that little lesson, is that that's 12 more damage than a grunt has HP. Which means pump action is pretty much always capable of one-shotting a grunt, and that means that this does make the pump action, or would make the pump action theoretically, an insane grunt clearer. And that's why that penalty at the bottom there as well, that new penalty I've added, times 2 shot spread, is actually a positive in disguise. So to explain this in terms of the reference, so in RoboQuest, weapons have affixes, which are kind of like upgrades, although they're usually achieved through sort of randomized rolls. They're either on the weapons when you find them, or there are ways to re-roll what affixes a weapon has. And these are just sort of attributes from a random selection that you can get. However, there is one that's called Wreck, and this actually is not a randomly attributed one. It's actually only available on specific weapons that have it built into them. And the weapon I'm using in the video is called the Behemoth Shotgun, so, you know, very fitting. And it has this affix called Wreck, and what Wreck means is that it says it's efficient against multiple enemies. What it actually does, I believe, I'm actually not sure this is the data mined sort of codified exact science behind what it's doing, but my understanding of the Wreck affix is that it basically makes it so that each pellet, it basically deals its full damage to every enemy that it hits. This doesn't mean that every single pellet actually deals full damage to a single enemy, for example. So that's something you need to keep in mind for this, for the Wrecker rework that I'm proposing. It's not going to make it deal like 12 times damage. It's not going to deal over 1,000 damage per shot, but it is going to deal the same amount of damage to every enemy that it hits specifically. So every enemy struck will take 120 damage, which makes the pellets only really relevant in the sense that they create the total damage, and given that there is now a higher spread, it means that the more pellets means there are more potential enemies hit. So hitting the same enemy with more than one pellet is actually irrelevant. I think it would be tweaked in such a way that it still deals the sort of base level of damage, which would be, 5. So let's say you hit a single enemy with 2 pellets. I suppose it's going to take 125 damage. Not 100, no, wait, 12. So 132, sorry. I looked at the number on the screen, it said 5, I went off of that. 132 damage. So basically, it's a way of dealing massive damage to multiple enemies at the same time. And I think this is only just about justified by pump action's already pretty potent ammo penalties. However, we are also removing the blow-through mechanic. I don't think this weapon needs to pierce enemies when we're adding this effect to it as well. It's just going to absolutely tear through anything, really. If this idea was to ever make it into the game, you need to take a lot of precautions, because you could even tear apart hordes of Praetorians with this overclock. Which is why, by the way, you'd actually be doing it a favour, stopping it from becoming overpowered, by taking away the shot spread penalty, to be honest, because that way you'd actually have to make sure that there are a good amount of enemies lined up inside your crosshairs to get good use out of this mechanic. And so where do I get off of suggesting an entirely new mechanic to just replace what pump action is? Well, frankly, I don't. And that's because, as I've already established, pump action is great. It's almost perfect. So what Wrecker really is, it's just a shot in the dark at something that I find kind of interesting. It's based on an old idea that's sort of been rekindled by playing RoboQuest. And I think it's just kind of neat. It's not something that I need pump action to be. It's entirely valid for it to actually be in some other form. That could actually be another Warthog overclock. I just said Warthog like such a British person, Jesus Christ. It could even be a boomstick overclock. I actually think that could be really cool. I think the boomstick could honestly take more advantage of it as well, because it has an inherently wider spread and higher pellet count. So that could easily be very interesting. Anyway, that's just sort of a taster of the types of things that we're going to be doing with reworks, and I'm going to immediately up the ante when it comes to Hyperalloy assembly. So Hyperalloy assembly is, of course, the balanced overclock for the stubby. Well, it was the new overclock that was added for the stubby, aside from the turret arc rework, and using it usually goes a little bit like this. Yeah, so as you can see, Hyperalloy assembly is kind of mid, unfortunately. It didn't sound like a horrible idea, but at the same time, I hope you didn't hear that. Well, obviously not a horrible idea, it is not an interesting idea either. It's literally just increasing weak point damage and increasing it by quite a bit, I guess, to justify some pretty hefty accuracy penalties, or more so recoil penalties, as you saw in the footage. And as you would obviously know if you've ever laid your hands on this thing, it kicks like a mule, and that phrase has never been more appropriate for a weapon, goodness me. It also has a magazine penalty built into it. Suffice to say, I don't mind Hyperalloy assembly, but I also don't enjoy using it. And that's not necessarily a good place to be in, especially when the stubby has pretty strong competition when you have such powerful overclocks as turret EM discharge and the reworked turret arc, or even EM refire booster, which is such a powerful DPS overclock. So the competition is stiff, and to really compete, we either need to be upping the ante on what Hyperalloy assembly is doing, or give it a new coat of paint. Let's start with upping the ante. With a small tweak, which I believe is entirely based around meeting some very specific breakpoints. It actually increases the weak point damage. Hold on, shouldn't there be? I thought there was supposed to be a description for that. I think there actually maybe is meant to be, but I guess not. So maybe it wasn't actually based on any breakpoints, but either way, this has actually decreased the accuracy penalties and increase the weak point damage. Or not decrease the accuracy penalties, rather actually increase the accuracy buffs. Although it has actually increased the magazine penalty. And I think the impetus behind this is to basically take what the overclock is doing on both sides of the fence and kind of amplify it a little bit. And that's mainly the weak point damage and the magazine size penalty, because those are the things, in my opinion, they're actually felt the least about the overclock. I think you feel the spread and you feel the recoil, you feel the fact that it's much more accurate, you feel the fact that it kicks like a mule. I don't always feel the fact that it does increase weak point damage, and I'm not always too worried about my magazine size either. So I think it would actually benefit Hyperalloy assembly for those things to be played up, because they inform your mod choices a heck of a lot more. Weak point damage will inform your mod choices because having it be even higher doesn't make taking weak point damage with Hyperalloy assembly an automatic pick. You know, it doesn't. You don't feel inherently like you have to take even more weak point damage because the overclock is doing a good amount of heavy lifting. But then when it comes to magazine size, you might feel a need to take increased magazine size wherever it's offered, even with sort of the weaker version where you're actually trading it for recoil. But of course, when it comes to tier 5, the accuracy or the magazine size mod in tier 5 is actually fairly powerful. So it doesn't come across as, or it comes across as you're going to need that more so than the other two, which you might have wanted beforehand. So I think it's going to create a little bit more of an interesting sort of build process of building this overclock. Probably be a little bit more interesting, although the changes are fairly minor. Let's get into something that's going to be a little bit more substantial. And this is actually our first buff, our first direct buff, I suppose, which means it's not a rework, but it is going to be benefiting the weapon exclusively. No negatives here. So this is actually much more of a, well, the tweak that I just showed you is definitely more of a buff than a nerf, but this is actually a proper buff. I mean, look at the weak point damage that we're adding here. I believe that the the penalties are actually left completely as they were, but the accuracy is further increased. We can actually check this, I suppose. Okay, so this is actually an interesting buff that I've taken on here, because it is actually nerfing some aspects slightly. Now, how am I going to justify that? Because of course, this actually, the accuracy bonuses here are actually not as strong as Hyperalloy Assembly is at base, but that's because I decided to take the direction of this being a buff. So this kind of is something that happens, I think, only a couple times in the course of the video, where a buff does come with some small negative changes, but it's still overall a buff because we're adding plus 55% weak point damage. And what that does, as you can see by the description, is it means that Stubby hits the 2-shot breakpoint for grunts. As long as you hit them in the face, as long as you're taking tier 1A, tier 3A, and tier 4A, and that's it really. So those upgrades, of course, so that's tier 1A, tier 3A, and tier 4A. That is increased damage on tier 1 and 3, and increased weak point damage on tier 4. Basically, take all the damage that you can, and you can 2-shot grunts to the face. Now, that is actually we've quickly come around to another example what I was talking about earlier with the pump action tweak, where it is a very notable breakpoint, but it's met under such specific circumstances. However, much like with that one, we also have a Praetorian breakpoint included for good measure. Not that I actually know the number that it takes to kill a Praetorian with this, but as we can see, what I do know is that it reduces that amount by 6 shots. I do have to say that is an exclusively weak point based statement though. That is all hits hit the weak point. Now, how do I justify this buff? Now that's an easy one. Hyperalloy Assembly is too weak. It's kind of as simple as that. I know that Ghost Ship have access to pick rate numbers for these overclocks, so I know that they know that Hyperalloy Assembly isn't that popular, and that's, by the way, that is actually an assumption on my part, but I'm pretty confident about that. I don't see why this overclock would be popular, and that's because it's just not very strong. And the reason why I think this works extremely well is because it kind of rewards someone who would do well with this overclock. And what I mean by that is Hyperalloy Assembly comes with recoil penalties, but rewards you for being extremely accurate. Of course, it does help you by increasing the accuracy, which is why I've actually decreased the accuracy bonuses a little bit, because the way I want this overclock to be, ideally, based on this buff, is better for people who are good with it, basically. And what I mean by that is, if you're not a particularly accurate FPS player, you're not going to do that good with Hyperalloy Assembly. But if you are like a very accurate player and you like the stubby, and you know you have those two things, you are going to be getting the most out of Hyperalloy Assembly. But frankly, when it comes to the people who are capable of getting the most out of this overclock, I don't think they're getting enough. I think they deserve more of a reward for their skill, and that's why I think we just need to bump the weak point damage up to kind of a little bit of an absurd degree. But then again, we're only changing what is the most important breakpoint in the game under absurdly specific conditions. It requires you to take 3 specific upgrades and to hit the grunt in the face, specifically, nowhere else. So I don't feel bad about this whatsoever. I think when it comes to an overclock that is just straight up a bit too weak, I think you have to sort of go off the deep end when it comes to buffs, which is why I think this is actually a more reasonable change than the tweak that I just showed you. What isn't as a reasonable change is the next thing we have to discuss, which is a rework called Bioelectric Necrosis. Play the clip. So you just saw Blistering Necrosis in action, I assume, just in case you forgot what it does. And so what the hell am I talking about now? So as you can see, a lot of Hyperalloy Assembly's points, its positives and negatives have been stripped away. Well, actually, really just the positives. They've kind of been replaced, at least numbers-wise and content-wise. So we start with, upon electrocution, generates blisters at point of impact. And we do still have a 25% weak point damage bonus. We have the same recoil and magazine size penalty, but we also have a max ammo penalty. So what am I doing adding necrosis to the stubby? Well, first of all, the blisters will hopefully be electric blue, not pus yellow, if you don't mind. So this comes from the idea of Hyperalloy assembly needing a fresh coat of paint to really stand up to things. And what I'm also doing here is giving in to the fact that I don't think Ghost Ship wants there to be that many overclocks in the game, which is why I'm not really suggesting this as a new overclock. I am definitely suggesting this as a rework to Hyperalloy assembly, because I think when it comes to a weak point focused modification for the stubby or weak point focused overclock, I think it demands something more unique. I think when you look at the meta of the stubby overclock, it's really divided into the king of the generic ones, which is the refi booster, and then the interesting ones that both stand by themselves. So really, for an overclock to stand up on its own ground, it needs to bring with it a unique mechanic. And the ability to generate blisters, first of all, it's interesting because it inherits weak point. Well, it inherits electrocution chance. So whenever you electrocute an enemy, it's going to generate a blister on them. And now this will also occur, by the way, even if you don't electrocute them. And what I mean by that is, when it comes to something like an oppressor or even a Praetorian, you won't actually electrocute them by hitting their armor, but you will spawn a blister if the bullet would have electrocuted the enemy, if that makes any sense. So the reason why that's interesting is because I don't think that would have any interaction with Electric Arc in Tier 5, but obviously it will with the increased electrocution chance in Tier 1, which makes that upgrade much more tempting, which I think is fair, because I think that upgrade needs a little bit of oomph. Sort of really justify using it, and I think being encouraged to take that upgrade for a weak point overclock is also really interesting. But we also do gain weak point damage. Now this will make the stubby both more self-sufficient, but also more of a support tool. And what's so good about that is, especially in contrast to Turret Arc, or whatever it's called now, and Turret E and Discharge, is that those are both sort of combat support overclocks, but they're not self-sufficient. The stubby is not self-sufficient when it comes to those overclocks. They rely on the turrets, or they rely on platforms. This doesn't rely on anything but itself, but it can really help other things. It can help your teammates out a lot, of course, and it can also really help you if you're using, let's say, a breach cutter or even hyper propellant. Imagine the work you could do with hyper propellant. I mean, I probably wouldn't use it with that. I'd probably use it with the breach cutter or the shard diffractor, but you could still do some pretty gnarly work. And that's why it's kind of kept in check by that unreliability. Basing it off of the weak point chance, they can then be buffed, but of course then you lose out on damage or ammo, which we're already adding a bit of a penalty to. So if you can picture this, hopefully the sort of footage of Blistering Necrosis helped a little bit of that. I hope you can imagine how this would be a very fun, interesting and dynamic way to use the stubby. There isn't sort of just a rehash of those other unique overclocks. I think this is unique in such a way where it's like I said, it's not relying on anything. The stubby can do all the work itself, but it still acts very much so as a support tool at the same time. And I think that is actually very emblematic of what an engineer could be if they were to let him be that. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with a character being very good at helping your teammates, but also being very strong in their own right, because we're not necessarily making the stubby a super powerful weapon, because obviously what would be packaged with this overclock would be a lot of tweaking and very specific numbers attributed to the blisters to make sure, I don't think it needs to be insanely strong. Let's say you have to build up a magazine's worth of blisters to one-shot a Praetorian with a breach cutter shot, something like that, I don't think it needs to be stupidly powerful, but I think the effect would be satisfying and dynamic enough to be useful in a lot of scenarios while still not inherently outperforming the super powerful AoE options for the turret-based overclocks, or just the really straightforward, satisfying DPS put out by Ian Refire Booster. But as it stands, what Hyperalloy Assembly is by default is not standing up against those overclocks. It's not unique enough and it's not strong enough. And I think both the buff that I proposed and this rework tap into both of those two avenues and would bring the stubby up to the right level in either one of those aspects. So I would tell Ghostship to heavily consider adding, well, first of all, just another form of necrosis would be really cool on any weapon. But if it could be the stubby, then I think it would just be really interesting. So that being said, let's move on to a weapon that's going to be a much shorter section, or an overclock that's going to be a much shorter section, which is of course the smart rifle with smart trigger operating system, which using it usually goes a little bit like this. There you go, Smart Trigger operating system. Obviously, we're just going to call it Smart Trigger from here on out. And I hope you can tell that Smart Trigger, as it is it's just good. And I mean that in every sense of the word, because it's good, but it is not great. And I'm going to explain why quickly. The first thing I'm going to do is explain why it's good, though. Smart Trigger is good because it turns the Smart Rifle into a DPS monster. It outputs damage insanely quickly and insanely reliably. And I don't think that it's sort of unreliability when it comes to, because the way Smart Trigger works, it's very eager to shoot, which means it actually sometimes shoots when you are not at the right angle to shoot. Very often, because of the way the Smart Rifle works, even if you take macro lens, the crosshair can be caught in such a way where it can lock onto an enemy, but because of your position, you're still not actually going to hit it. This happens quite a lot, and it's a very big problem with Smart Trigger because it's so eager to just shoot. You can't hold the lock, obviously. Which, by the way, I think that would actually be fair to put down as a penalty, right? The fact that it fires, you can't hold a lock. But so, even on top of that, I think that if you just need to be clever enough with your positioning, that you're kind of using it like an assault rifle anyway, not necessarily as a smart rifle. And as long as you can sort of view it that way, it becomes a DPS monster that is also capable of actually dealing more damage than you realise. Now, we are going to be talking about something to do with damage and total damage that's quite particular when it comes to the actual suggested changes for the smart rifle or for Smart Trigger. But it is important to mention what is talked about in the sort of subtext here, and that's actually not the only thing that's worth talking about, because just because it can trigger electrocution with only 2 locks, which is an upgrade that usually requires you to get at least 3 locks on an enemy to cause the electrocution, it's got more up its sleeve than that. Obviously, that in and of itself means that you can trigger electrocution with only 2 locks, right? Which means you can, if you're clever, you can get a lot more damage because you can electrocute a lot of different enemies by only placing 2 locks on them, which is obviously 2 bullets that are going to be instantly fired, but you'll still get the electrocution effect. And because of how the Smart Trigger works, or how the Smart Rifle works, it actually does apply the electrocution before the bullets hit, which means you always get that damage bonus, which is really good. The damage bonus, I think, is called electrochemical rounds, and it's in tier 3. You should pretty much always be running that. It's kind of hard to imagine why you wouldn't. And something else that it also does, there is also the tier 5 upgrade for the Smart Rifle, which adds damage at full locks. Because of how the Smart Rifle works, because of how it works in tandem with the upgrade, or with the Overclock specifically, our maximum number of locks is only ever 2 or 4, and they are required basically instantly on top of that. So what happens there is you get up to maximum locks in fractions of a second every time you shoot, which means you're getting those max locks, which means you're getting that damage bonus from the tier 5 upgrade. And where that sort of improves the weapon over base is The only other time it's really feasible to get to max locks and not feel like a chump is by using Executioner. But Executioner relies on weak points to deal its full damage, and has a small ammo penalty built into it. Smart Trigger not only does it not rely on weak points, it also doesn't have an ammo penalty. So you could trigger that damage bonus from the tier 5 upgrade for damage bonus at full locks extremely easily, and so easily and in such a way that you are absolutely gaining more damage over the base smart rifle. Even if you would technically call it theoretical, it's very real, I think. So just keep that in mind. But of course, I did mention ammo a couple of times because when it comes to the smart rifle, there's only one thing that we're doing to it, and that is adding ammo. So this is a buff, and all it does, it adds 36 or 72 ammo. Now, the brackets there, that is not based on like an upgrade or anything. That is just a suggestion. The base suggestion here is to simply make it so Smart Trigger adds 36 ammo. First of all, I want to thank a bunch of people: Mega I Don't Know, Flapjack RT, Syringe Based Potato, and Mr. Cheese 8097. And like I said, just about everyone else with a common lick of sense. Yeah, that's right. That's what I meant to say. Because this is the only change that I've suggested for the Smart Trigger Overclock. And that might come across as weird, especially where I gave a pretty like self-admittedly unnecessary rework idea for pump action. But where the justification comes in for that is pump action's already pretty much where it needs to be. So I was kind of suggesting that for the hell of it. Smart Trigger, however, while it's good, it's not quite where it needs to be, and it's only one change away from being exactly where it needs to be. So just to really emphasize the solidarity and the solitary nature of that, I've just created an isolated buff for it that really encapsulates all that needs to change. Smart Trigger kind of in and of itself demands an ammo overclock or an ammo buff because it's so ammo hungry. Now, the thing about the smart rifle is, and everyone can kind of admit this at this point, it's got an ammo problem. It burns through ammo extremely quickly, even if it does do good damage. And there's a reason why there's only really 2 overclocks that are used with it, which is done, by the way, because Seeker Rounds is amazing, but that's neither here nor there. The point is, the Smart Rifle has an ammo problem, but if Ghost Ship can't admit that, they can at least admit that Smart Trigger is ammo hungry, and highlights the need for this change. So, whether it gets added to the base weapon or added to Smart Trigger, I think we're winning either way, because I think that Explosive Chemical Rounds and Executioner will still very much so remain meta. They are extremely strong and extremely satisfying to use, and I think Smart Trigger is unstable enough and still would be ammo hungry enough to not immediately beat them out. It would, however, definitely beat out any of the other competition that weren't competition already. And now, I do think that things like Neuro Lasso and Arm Brake Module really should be better than they are, or be something else entirely, but Smart Trigger, as a newly added overclock, does not deserve to fall by the wayside. It's a really strong idea, and the idea is pretty much perfect. I don't think it needs to change at all. The only thing that needs to change is we need to have the Smart Rifle's main problem alleviated somewhat. And I do think partially it would be better for the Smart Trigger to receive this buff than the base weapon, because if we were to give, putting on the base weapon would be giving an ammo buff to Executioner and Explosive Chemical Rounds, and I think that would be overpowered, where I think that Smart Trigger getting that wouldn't be overpowered. So I think it makes a lot more sense actually to give it to Smart Trigger. Argument could also be maybe add half of each, so add 18 to the base weapon, 18 to Smart Trigger, or 36 to Smart Trigger and 36 to the base weapon as well, but then Smart Trigger would get really out of hand. I just think it's a really simple situation where the overclock needs this one simple change to become exactly what it needs to be. And the Smart Rifle is a weapon that's far more likely to get a more thorough going over if I were to do a video about all of the overclocks on the weapons, which is a chance of me doing later on, which would be basically this format but for every overclock. That would not be done in one go. I'm looking at the time that this is taking, and I'm starting to realise that it's kind of crazy that I'm doing this in one go, but I don't think it would be wise for me to split this video up. So you're welcome, or I'm sorry, depending on how you feel about video length. Either way, that's a Smart Rifle done, and that means that Engineer is done as well. So it's time to move on to the big brutal bastard, the man of the hour, the man with the gun. Gunner.
Here, get into cover!
So, Gunner is probably the strongest class in the game, in a very generalised sense. I think that's reflected by what is an assessment based entirely on anecdotal experience. It just seems to me like Gunner is probably the least picked main, but everyone seconds him. He's everyone's second choice, and I think that's a good thing because I think that represents a quite sort of perfect level of balance. Because when I say he's the strongest class in the game, I don't necessarily mean on every single build-to-build basis. I think there are definitely driller builds, engineer builds, and kind of even scout builds that outperform some of Gunner's builds, or even a lot of them. But what Gunner has is pretty genuine consistency. I'd say the only point of real inconsistency is how much stronger the coil gun can be than his other secondaries, but they all have extremely powerful options. It's really just the fact that his primary weapons are so damn good, and that's why, even with the first overclock, we can be talking about Rotary Overdrive, which I don't think is great. It's still actually kind of worth using. So anyway, without further ado, let's talk about that overclock, so you can better understand what I just said. And that is, of course, like I said, Rotary Overdrive. Now, Rotary Overdrive is kind of weird. I mean, look, take a look at this. So, yeah, you might be able to tell the Rotary Overdrive is kind of confusing, because if you are aligned with me and your alignment with me on the opinion you have about this overclock is going to be based on that video, then you will probably find it confusing as well, where it's kind of the thing that is almost meant to be a nerf is actually the better thing about Rotary Overdrive, because Rotary Overdrive does a couple things, as you can probably tell. Well, the main things that it does that are really of note is adding the quick chill charges, but also increasing the rate of fire. And the rate of fire is kind of propped up by the description of the overclock, as like, oh, we pushed the rate of fire to its limit, but we also added these things that help you keep the heat in check. And it creates this weird sensation of an overclock where it's like, it's not particularly useful, but it's also definitely not bad. The minigun does have a large enough ammo pool to take advantage of this rate of fire. However, there is something to be said about the fact that minigun overclocks are dominated by two categories, which is single target and AoE. You have all of the damage-based ones, of which Leadstorm usually rises to the top, but I think exhaust vectoring is slightly better than that. And then you have all the AoE ones, which are Bullet Hell and Burning Hell, both of which are pretty great, but Burning Hell, of course, usually rises to the top. And then you have Rotary Overdrive, which is kind of neither. It's like very abstract single target and very abstract AoE. The AoE is, of course, meant to be achieved through using the quick chill charges to repeatedly aggressively vent. And you saw that in the second clip, when you have to basically build the weapon up to its maximum level of heat, and as soon as it overheats, you use a quick chill charge, and then you just keep firing until you overheat again. But I find it to be extremely impractical. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, I actually go down in the clip. I'm not sure about that. I should be, but I think that's how it goes, and that kind of is emblematic of what using this overclock is like when you're trying to use it for what it's actually intended to be. Because it has been put out there by, I think it was Anders actually, from Ghost Ship, who said that it is designed to work with the tier 5 upgrades for the minigun. Particularly obviously hot bullets and aggressive venting, because they are effects that only activate when the weapon is at high heat. Obviously, being more of a fan of the rate of fire aspect, I find myself using the hot bullets version a lot more, because I think that's a lot more useful. But that's why, aside from the rework, I suppose, which is kind of interesting, much of what this is focused around, much of what the changes I'm going to be proposing are focused around, is actually propping up that aggressive venting aspect, because I think as it stands, using this overclock that way is really bad. I think it's actually kind of terrible, and I think it's terrible because you really can't, you basically can't use it on solo. And I know that leans into how biased, I claimed that the video is going to be biased, and it is biased towards my perspective, but I do not quite understand how you're really meant to use this outside of multiplayer. And even more specifically, I feel like you need more enemies on like tough enemies. And even then, I said tough enemies sort of subconsciously, I kind of meant enemy frequency, but you kind of need tough enemies as well. And this is Hazard 5+ stuff, by the way. You kind of need tough enemies as well, because to justify it, because it's not like repeated aggressive venting is actually good against anything at all. Because a single aggressive venting activation will just kill every single grunt in a radius. That includes slashers as well, and Mac Terror spawn. But more than that, it's going to take so much ammo, even with Rotary Overdrive, to kill anything stronger, and that even goes for a guard. I understand with heat propagation, the guards will probably go down fairly quickly, but if you're thinking about bigger enemies, they're not going down to aggressive venting. And we're not going to change that necessarily, but what I am going to change is making aggressive venting a lot more accessible, and that is where our first suggestion comes in, which is just a simple tweak, but it's going to be a very impactful tweak. In fact, the weapon is actually exactly the same. The overclock is exactly the same with this tweak, except for the second point. I've added in brackets that using a charge also counters overheating. Now, what that means is, well, actually, there's no description, I suppose. What that means is this is going to work exactly how the DRAC works when you're using manual heat dump and aggressive venting. That being, as long as you're above 50% heat, you can press reload to manually overheat, right? And that's the difference between quick chill charges and manual heat dump. And part of me almost thinks that the way that quick chill charges are constructed is to deliberately avoid that. But the problem with that is, as I've just explained about all of the downsides of Rotary Overdrive trying to use aggressive venting, that philosophy, if I'm correct in assuming that that's how the overclock was constructed, is wrong. It's not conducive to satisfying or even a beneficial improvement to your weapon at all. But if, however, we could activate aggressive venting early, and obviously if you know how manual heat dump works with aggressive venting on the DRAC, you know that it is substantially weaker unless you fully overheat, and that will be carried over here because it does end up being extremely powerful. You become very capable of killing large amounts of enemies at close range with pretty much no effort. So you would want to carry over the fact that there is like a decline in strength the closer you are to 50% heat. You would still kind of want to be going for maximum overheat most of the time, but you aren't forced into it. Because what's so good about aggressive venting is that it's a really powerful fear mechanic. And where Rotary Overdrive's rate of fire is actually supposed to be a downside is the fact that rate of fire does not increase heat generation. Of course, the overclock does come with a heat generation downside, so you can actually look at these two, the bonus and the penalty at the bottom here, as being on the opposite side of the fence when it comes to trying to use the overclock with aggressive venting. The rate of fire is a downside because it makes you use more ammo without actually increasing heat generation, but the heat generation actually gets you closer to aggressive venting. And these two things can stay the same as long as we are able to take advantage of things like aggressive venting, or specifically aggressive venting earlier. Of course, if you were using hot bullets, for example, you wouldn't want to overheat early necessarily. You would want to quick chill only at the very last second. And also, I should also clarify, I think I do partially understand why it was made with this approach. It's because if you made it count as overheating, it would feel kind of clunky because you'd be forced into an overheat, right? And that is how it worked with aggressive venting. And quick chill is done in such a way where it doesn't actually affect that at all. It's a very quick press against the sort of the vent thing, and then you're back to shooting immediately. There's no actual overheat animation. And also having it work with aggressive venting early without having to go through a venting animation could end up being a little bit too powerful. And I do acknowledge that, and I think that could either be sort of adjusted through certain tweaks, or maybe tweaking how it actually works. Maybe it does actually overheat properly if you do it early, perhaps. Either way, I can kind of see where they were coming from if I'm right about that being the philosophy behind the Overclock's conception, but I still think this is the way forward as far as making that aspect of the Overclock good. Because, look, I understand some people got use out of it, and I understand especially on things like modern difficulties, but I don't think I can really have my mind changed about this. I think it's really, really bad in that aspect. I think when it comes to just the fire rate and sort of going for a DPS build, it's actually pretty solid, and there's definitely a reason to do that as long as you can sort of keep your ammo in check. But when it comes to the aggressive venting side of things, I'm just not really with it. And I think we need to sort of take a little bit of a different approach as well, something that sort of caters to both sides of the fence, which is going to be a direct buff, where I actually haven't included the manual heat dump mechanic here. And this is, of course, partially suggested by Syringe-Based Potato, who I believe suggested giving it more ammo. And I think that's actually a really good idea. Now, we need to be careful because, of course, the minigun does have a couple ammo overclocks. And look, Finn's drum walls, the clean one, is never really going to have any legs to stand on. That's kind of a shame, but it's also just the truth. It's a really mediocre clean ammo overclock. There is, however, the balanced one, which I can't remember the name of. Is it just lightweight rounds? It's probably not. Either way, I think that overclock is... well, I know it's not used very much because it's not that great, but it's still quite a bit of ammo, and I don't want that niche to be sort of overtaken by Rotary Overdrive, which is why I think the amount of ammo added in here is a bit more appropriate. Now, you might notice the number, you might be a bit confused. You might have already noticed this number thing going on with the rate of fire, where the numbers are actually doubled or halved. Now, I want to point out, when it comes to the rate of fire and the max ammo, they're actually inverted, so the true rate of fire that's added is 3, and the true max ammo that's added is 150. I'm not sure why it's done like that. It's because when it comes to the rate of fire thing, this information was, I think, copied directly from carl.gg, an amazing website, by the way, an amazing tool. But it's copied directly from there, and that's the order they put it in. I thought it made more sense to put the true version in the brackets, because the 300 is what you see added on the stat screen, and so is the 6. But in case you didn't know, the minigun's ammo and rate of fire stats are doubled, literally just for show. It's a really weird aspect of the game that's kind of present in not a lot of areas, but it's present on here, and I think kind of the Zukovs as well, although that's not as clear cut. Either way, the idea here is we are increasing the ammo, but also increasing the heat generation at the same time. Now, I think by increasing to 100%, we are, of course, amplifying how much of a positive it is, but we are also making it a bit more of a negative as well. It's, especially if you're using it for DPS, it makes using them a lot more tempting, which means you're actually going to be using quick chill charges a lot more. And I think that's actually kind of important, because I have seen a bit of a recurring consensus, which is that you probably have a bit too many of them, which I think is probably true, even though I don't tend to use them that much. But anyway, so having more max ammo and more heat generation is going to allow for more chances to activate aggressive venting sort of naturally, and also that max ammo means that it's not automatically outperformed by damage based overclocks that increase the total damage we're capable of. Now, of course, there is the element of being able to get to hot bullets quicker and maintain hot bullets for longer, does also increase your overall DPS, but I still think it's definitely the overclock is definitely being outclassed by lead storm and exhaust vectoring specifically. So I think actually adding max ammo and increasing heat generation further is actually a significant DPS boost more than anything else, because of course we do burn through ammo quicker with our increased rate of fire. So I think this actually makes a lot of sense as a sort of basic buff that doesn't change the overclock mechanically, but it does enhance both aspects of the overclock. An overclock that I think is relatively underbaked. I think the idea is somewhat strong, although I still find it confusing because it doesn't inherently amplify either aspect of the minigun, which is what its meta overclocks do. But I still think it's a fairly interesting idea, and I think the execution was close to being good because it works for at least one half of the weapon's identity. But this is a buff that kind of enhances both sides. Looking at it closer, it probably enhances the DPS a little bit more, but then again, people seem to like the aggressive venting aspect, so this will only improve that. So maybe overall, I'm not destined to really understand that side of things, but maybe it could still stand for a little bit of a buff, because, you know, I feel like if you do well with it, then maybe you deserve it to be a little bit better. So echoing a sentiment I came up with for Hyperalloy assembly, I suppose. Anyway, we're not done with Rotary Overdrive, however. So let's take a look at a rework, which is actually not a renamed rework. There are a couple of these. Not every rework is going to be renamed. In fact, that goes for cluster charges as well, but not the Thunderhead, not Mortar rounds, and you'll see that in a minute. But this rework obviously brings the category up to unstable, and it does some stuff. So a lot of aspects are like left the same. So the quick chill charges are the same amount. Same heat reduction. Actually, no, it's different heat reduction. Different heat reduction. Same amount of heat generation added, and well, actually, that's it. A lot of other things have changed. So we basically added something where using a charge gives you rate of fire and damage. However, you start with your damage and rate of fire reduced by the amount of one charge. And these effects stack, and like I said, it lasts for 15 seconds. But using one also consumes 50 ammo, or 25 true ammo, but 50 in sort of what you're going to be seeing. And I think this comes from a place of the Overclock already suggesting self-buffing into its very existence. And I think sort of extending that to damage isn't nonsensical, at the very least. This is a little bit of an out there rework, but at the same time, I don't think it's an out there overclock. That's actually a bit more important, where something like necrosis is a pretty extreme idea. I don't think this is the most extreme idea, and I do want to play a quick clip, and I almost forgot about it because it's like, it took me a while to actually get the footage for this. But anyway, take a look at this. So that was something from RoboQuest, once again, as you could tell. It basically, weapons in RoboQuest have, or can have, alternate firing modes, or just alt fires, but these can extend to things like a buff, something called Booster, which basically increases rate of fire and reload speed for a short amount of time. Reload speed, not really important. The fact is, it's a sort of separate kind of ammo pool. Obviously in RoboQuest you have infinite ammo, so it's not really an ammo pool, but it's sort of like a separate thing that you activate, and then it has to sort of recharge that increases your rate of fire temporarily. So I kind of want to do the same thing here, but I also want to add damage, and the reason why I want to add damage is because if we're adding an effect that you can manually activate that increases rate of fire and damage, increases your DPS overall, like by quite a bit, but also consumes ammo. This is an overclock that will allow you to achieve greater DPS, much greater DPS than, say, even the DPS overclocks like Lead Storm, but at probably a higher cost, where you're not going to have that forever, and you're going to be losing ammo by doing it. In fact, you're going to lose more and more ammo the more you do it, because it consumes ammo to use a charge, and it also increases rate of fire, which kind of increases ammo consumption as well. So you really do need to be careful, but at the same time, that is really just there as a bonus in a way, or at least both sides of it are also a bonus. If you're someone who likes how quick chill works, or likes how the overclock works with aggressive venting, you can still use it exactly that way. And also you do need to keep in mind, if you want to like combine the DPS of this overclock and hot bullets, you need to be careful, because the more charges you use, the more heat you lose, which might take you away from hot bullets. So I think it would add a really, really interesting dichotomy. It would add damage in a way that is more engaging and sort of just demanding, from like a thought perspective, from a strategy perspective, but potentially with a higher skill ceiling than something like Leadstorm, which kind of does have a high skill ceiling, but this is kind of doing it in a way that doesn't make you have to stand still, because that's why Leadstorm is bad as an overclock. The damage is amazing, and I think just doing something like increasing the movement penalty is actually fine, but making you have to stand still sucks major dick. Anyway, but I don't think this sucks major dick. I hope the idea comes through pretty strongly, even if it would make a bit more sense as a separate overclock, but at the same time it doesn't, because it lets us use the quick chill charges for something else. Which, by the way, in this context, you can use a quick chill charge at any time, although I suppose there is something interesting to be said about how maybe it actually is better to use the quick chill, or have it still only be usable above 50% heat. That might be more interesting as far as like how you achieve this extra damage goes, which means it would actually be hard to stack up loads of them. But I still like the idea of like before fighting a boss you can just use all of the stacks, but that would like use 600 ammo. Is that right? I think it's 600. Yeah, it would use 600 ammo on the spot and give you like an insane rate of fire and DPS like damage boost. So you would burn through a lot of ammo, but you might be able to kill a Dreadnought in like seconds. But obviously you wouldn't, because Dreadnoughts are constructed in quite a clever way now where you can't cheese them in that way. So it wouldn't be completely overpowered, I don't think. It's still the kind of thing where to make it into the game, some tweaking would be required to make sure it doesn't just go completely off the rails. Anyway, it's time to take a look at the next weapon on the chopping block, which is of course the one and only Thunderhead with our friend Mortar rounds. Take a look at this.
Begin their glow. Get the eggs to Storm and Molly and get back alive.
So if you somehow didn't realise it already, Mortar rounds is kind of completely busted. It is an insanely powerful overclock. It is also one of the most extreme changes that an overclock brings. I think really the only comparison is actually Fatboy. As far as like the changes, the decrease in ammo and the increase in damage are beyond extreme. And I'd say even if they're comparable to Fatboy, I'd say it's more extreme just because we're dealing with such insane numbers. Like, when you look at Fatboy, going from roughly 10 max ammo, if we're not including ammo upgrades, going from roughly 10 max ammo down to 3, I think isn't as crazy, even if it's proportionally pretty much the same. It's not as crazy as going from, what is it, 550 to down to 220, you know? Losing over 300 ammo but gaining 7 times area damage is absolutely absurd. And I think in terms of just sort of the concept and the delivery of the concept and just the overall strength of the overclock, it's actually pretty much perfect. It tears through hordes of smaller enemies, and it's actually surprisingly effective against larger enemies, while also having, I think, really appropriate downsides. I think you feel the ammo penalty very much so. And you do have to work with the mortar projectiles and sort of the literal projectile fall off to get the best out of the overclock, and the friendly fire that's included is actually very valid as well. I think the only arguable downside is something that I believe we're going to be addressing with the very first suggestion, because the only downside that I think the weapon has, or the overclock has, I keep saying weapon instead of overclock, the only downside I think the overclock has is the fact that the explosions probably aren't as big as they feel like they should be. And obviously that sounds kind of strange, because it's like, well, what do you mean? Because they do so much area damage. And I say they do, but they also kind of, they don't affect as much of an area as they almost look like they do, you know? You would kind of expect the mortar rounds to have a really big radius. It's actually a relatively small radius increase. I think it's actually, I don't even know if it's actually more than Carpet Bomber. It's really just feels like more because of the amount of damage, and because the radius is actually probably a bit bigger than you think when it comes down to it. But I think there is something that we can do here to sort of help mortar rounds out, because I understand that it would be pretty overpowered if it had like a 3 times AoE radius as well. But I think there are ways around this. I think there's a way to increase this effect, and it's pretty clear here. The changes are pretty simple. We're going from 7 times area damage down to 5 times area damage, but we're going from 1.25 times effect radius to 2.25 times effect radius. And as you can see, this still retains the grunt 2-shot breakpoint. I want to point out, when it comes to mortar rounds, the grunt breakpoint is actually technically only exists within the maximum damage radius, which is something that is very important to point out about AoE damage, is that pretty much all forms of AoE damage, I think the exceptions are usually things like cluster bombs, I think, can't say for certain, but pretty much all forms of AoE damage have a maximum and minimum damage radius, and they have damage fall off. So the maximum damage radius is like the smaller one, where it's like this is the radius within which it deals its full damage. So with mortar rounds, it's like it's not that entire whatever it is 3-meter radius. It's actually it's about half of that. But what this does, by being 5 times damage instead of 7 times damage, we can still 2-shot grunts with that maximum damage radius. But outside of it, it gets weaker pretty quickly. But we still retain that. We retain the most important thing that it has, which is the ability to tear through hordes of grunts extremely quickly. And in fact, we're amplifying it by bumping up the effect radius. But by decreasing that area damage a bit as well, we're making it not as tempting of a thing to use against larger enemies. When you're taking effect radius more than damage a little bit, it's like probably not going to use this against Praetorians as much unless there's like a lot of them in quite a small area. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing for mortar rounds. I think mortar rounds is very competitive with like all of the Thunderhead's overclocks, and well, I don't think that's a bad thing, because I think you can sort of do kind of better by going in for Neurotoxin or Big Bertha, or even potentially Carpet Bomber. I do think that you need to be careful, because it is really good at both things. It's still slightly better at AoE, but I don't think it's the kind of thing that should be competing with AoE at all, or competing with single target damage at all. Although I would say the Thunderhead, it's got more AoE options and single target options, and I think it should be a healthy balance of both, but it's not like mortar rounds should be the single target option anyway. We kind of need another overclock for that, so that's neither here nor there. I still think this kind of makes sense as a way to tweak mortar rounds, and to sort of change the feeling of it in a way that makes sense with what the concept is. Where we kind of lose a little bit of that is in if we were to actually buff the overclock. So this was suggested by Kingston42069, who simply wanted it to be stronger. And I thought to myself, well, this is obviously ridiculous and overpowered and shouldn't happen. But if I were to do it, I would make the damage times 10. And I don't think this is a particularly accidental number either. I believe what this does is makes it so that it can easily 2-shot grunts in the entire effect radius and 1-shot them at the center of the blast. Oh, actually, I'm mistaken. It can actually 1-shot grunts in the entire effect radius, which will turn you into an absolute grunt killing machine, which is just actually hilarious. This couldn't happen. The only way this could happen is if you tank the ammo even more, and that might just be a step too far. Even if it's like overall technically balanced, I think having a weapon with still over 100 ammo that can 1-shot as many grunts as in its effect radius with that much ammo is just a step too far. It's just kind of ridiculous. I mean, I think Gunner's primary weapons already look kind of ridiculous when you compare them to something like the M1000. It's just like, this is like stronger in literally every way, but this is a step too far. I just wanted to sort of throw this out there as like, this is what we could do, how we could make this overclock like tap into this insane level of power fantasy. It's like you could 1-shot grunts anywhere in the radius. There is, however, I think a more of a middle ground of this, which is another tweak where I've kind of done something similar, and this is very much so a tweak. So the only positive changes here are the fact that we now have no damage fall off, which is a mechanic I've already explained. So it now deals its full whatever is 77 damage in the entire effect radius, which means it can 2-shot grunts and I believe also 2-shot slashers within the entire effect radius. So if you were to hit a grunt with the very edge of the blast, it would still go down in 2 shots. And I think that is a substantial enough change where I've actually slightly increased the ammo penalties. It's now 0.295 times magazine size and ammo compared to whatever it was before, like times 0.33 or something. And I think that would be necessary if we were to do something like this, because you probably don't realise how strong it would be without damage fall off. It would just tear through grunts in a way that's kind of absurd, and would be better against larger enemies, because very often, especially if you're shooting them from a distance, let's say you're using mortar rounds to pick off something like a spitballer, which you probably shouldn't, because gun and secondaries tend to be pretty good for that kind of thing, but say that you were, you'll probably do a lot more damage this way because of the inaccuracy of the mortar projectiles. Doesn't matter that much anymore as long as the enemy is getting damaged. And I think overturning that inaccuracy and inconsistency is not necessarily wise, but it is a way of achieving the ridiculousness that was that buff in a slightly more balanced fashion. What isn't quite as balanced is something that runs deep in my veins. I probably shouldn't have said that given what the name of the overclock is, but either way, this is Little Men. Play that fucking clip.
Rock and roll! Stone, everyone! Zip line, done.
So, thank you, Enrico Bolagnani. I probably mispronounced your name, I do apologise, but this is a person who made a really cool set of modded overclocks, and this is one of them. And I remember watching this video and thinking, adding radiation to one of Gunner's primaries, I think we did something like that before, and some of you may recall, if there are any of you who recall this, I would love to know who's watching this that watched that video. But for the Hurricane, Tyler suggested something called Little Men, which basically made the missiles radioactive. Upon impact with anything, they would create a pool of radiation, and that is what Little Men is going to do to the Fundead. And I would admit, the kind of reason why I've done this is because that video exists, the one that you just saw, by the way, the modded overclock, because someone kind of brought this to life, so you can kind of really visualize what it's going to do. So we've just basically just taken it as it is, but we've amplified some aspects. Like, for example, they have even more decreased velocity, which is going to create a much more advanced level of like having to work against the weapon's projectile velocity. And have also decreased the magazine size and ammo even further, because of course our mortar rounds now leave fallout on impact, which is crazy. I don't think it would be stacking damage, but you would also sort of be racking up this just insane like field of damage. You probably would start just spraying mortar rounds in sort of a random fashion, not even necessarily hitting enemies, just knowing that they're coming. But even when they are like coming at you, you would still use it, and you would sort of kill loads of enemies in like sort of your volley, and then kill loads more with the remaining radiation. It would be extremely powerful, it would be extremely fun, extremely satisfying, and it would satisfy a desire that I think me and Tyler, and I think a lot of people have had for a while. And I think it comes down to a lot of things. I think it gives more weight to the radiation effect, which we only really have access to in sort of two forms currently, which is of course Fat Boy and gamma contamination on the wave cooker. And of course, seeing mortar rounds and Fat Boy are sort of analogous to each other, I think it would make more sense. And that's why it's also Little Men, because it's like Fat Boy is a combination of little boy and Fat Man. So it's like, well, what about Little Men? Because there's a bunch of them. And like I said, it would just be insanely fun and powerful. It would also be slightly worse at single target, because we're sacrificing a lot more ammo for this effect. So you would just be laying waste to enemies directly and indirectly. And I think you at least cannot deny how fun that would be. And honestly, I don't think it would be overpowered either. It would be overpowered in the context of AoE, and it would kind of trounce probably even Neurotoxin. But I think it's such an extreme change though to the playstyle, with like the even heavier projectiles and the massive ammo penalties, that something like Neurotoxin, where its entire gimmick is basically ammo economy, probably wouldn't actually suffer too much. So all I'm saying is consider it, and I'm almost tempted to play the clip again, but I'm not going to do that because I don't want to create my editing for myself. So let's talk about cluster charges. If you somehow haven't seen cluster charges in action before, well, now's your chance. Take a look at this. So, once again, if you somehow haven't experienced this Overclock before, you might be aware of the fact that it is, whatever this word means, busted. It is probably even more busted than Mortar rounds, to be honest. It is obscenely powerful and obscenely efficient. However, I will say it's a little bit more statistically sort of unrounded. It's a little bit strange in the way that it's constructed numbers-wise. And I do seek to sort of kind of tweak that into sort of perfection if I can. Cluster Charges is like weirdly good at everything except, I would say, flying enemies. And that's why I think it's perfectly balanced, by the way, because it's like it's really amazingly powerful at just tearing through groups of smaller enemies, and better than Mortar rounds. Something that Cluster Charges is really good at is tiny enemies. Cluster Charges is actually amazing against swarmers, which is nice because not many things are. And it's also amazing against really chunky targets. The only exception would be Oppressors because of their explosive damage resistance, but things like Praetorians up to Dreadnoughts you can actually do really well against. Well, there are aspects to the Overclock that I kind of want to, I guess, tweak out of existence. And this thing here, I want to very quickly get into the second point here. The idea of the missiles clustering on impact of enemies or terrain. Play that sludge pump footage. So, yeah, the sludge pump is basically doing what I think cluster charges should be able to do. Cluster charges, by default, has this weird kind of proclivity for unclustered damage, right? You can see it doubles the direct damage and the AoE damage of the normal missiles, and this is because they are literally like all the cluster bombs tied together in one rocket before you actually cluster them. The problem with it, however, is that they're still overall weaker than a clustered bomb. So if you actually have all of the bomblets hit the same enemy, that does more damage than hitting with a single rocket. And what's more important about that is the damage on those things is only doubled, right? But the magazine size and ammo are more than halved. So they're kind of abstract, and I've chosen to take the route of just removing that aspect entirely. But what we gain instead, of course, the missiles still have the base hurricane damage, but what we gain from that, we gain that, still retaining that damage, but also having them cluster even when they make impact, like how the sludge pump charge shots do. This means that the missiles will sort of come out of where the bomblets will come out of where the missile hits, so we can still deal direct damage to an enemy, and then the bomblets will come out and hopefully deal even more damage to that enemy. So we are actually definitely gaining more damage here by adding this mechanic, even though I'm taking away a double damage bonus, which almost doesn't make sense, but it literally does. So it literally works that way. So I think that's really interesting, and I think also just in general, mechanically speaking, I think this is how the Overclock should work anyway. I think the clustering should be able to occur manually or automatically, and automatically will obviously come from when it makes impact, and that will be first of all, it will make more sense. It will boost the damage slightly, but in a way that gets rid of this weird sort of obtuse massive bonus that it already had. and it would just be a lot more fun and a lot more satisfying to use, I think. Especially when it comes to like hitting flying enemies, you can sort of hit a single Mactera and then all the missiles will come off and like maybe hit other Macteras. It could end up being like really satisfying. You'd have to think a little bit less about like tiny enemies and whatnot. We are, however, still retaining the projectile velocity penalty. If you took that away, it would actually be hard to justify manually clustering. I think the idea of manually clustering to sort of hit your enemies when the missiles are sort of over where you want to hit is actually a really good mechanic, and I don't want to lose that, but I also don't see the need to retain this really obtuse buff that wasn't really doing anything, when instead we could have this much more engaging mechanic. Anyway, there are other places we could actually go with cluster charges as well, such as a direct path. Let's take a look at what we're doing here. So this is actually the opposite of the tweak that I just suggested, and we're not having that impact cluster mechanic. What we're doing instead is actually buffing those direct and area damage bonuses so that they actually match what they should. So what that does is makes it so even if you were to just use the normal rockets without clustering them at all, you would still be gaining more total damage. And that's of course substantiated by the fact that they deal much more damage on impact. Say you took this with Napalm, you're easily one-shotting grunts with single rockets, like you are even if you cluster with Napalm, or even cluster without. So this makes speccing into that aspect of the Overclock much more interesting, because it's kind of implying, by having double direct damage and area damage, it's kind of implying that you could tap into that aspect of the weapon, take the AoE, or even take the direct damage upgrades and do well. But you don't, because the clustering mechanic is so much stronger. If we have the two actually be competitive, we basically have two overclocks in one, which is kind of already suggesting that it is, but based on the actual numbers, it isn't, because clustering is always stronger. But with this version, that's no longer the case. They're now actually competitive. So while it might be a bit too strong to have those two overclocks in one, it at least makes the non-clustered buffs worth speccing into. And I think that would be really important, because if they want that to be part of the overclock, if they want it to double your direct and area damage, then it should be worth speccing into those things. So you've either got to reduce the ammo penalty, or you've got to increase those bonuses beyond just double. And I don't think I'm wrong. Obviously, if I thought I was wrong, I wouldn't be suggesting it, but either way, there you go. Now, I believe this is the final thing. It's a rework. It is not a named rework, but it is still a rework nonetheless, because I think the number of changes involved sort of entail that. So you can see we actually do have a nerf to direct and area damage instead of a bonus, and also projectile velocity is actually increased. Not as a bonus, it's just that the penalty has been lessened somewhat. And we're also bringing back the mechanic of impact clustering, so when they hit enemies or terrain, they cluster like how the Sludge Pump Charge Shot does, like we've already seen. But the biggest thing they've added here that kind of punctuates this as a rework is the fact that bomblets retain guidance as long as the trigger is held. This basically means that you can use guided clusters. And I think the main use case for this would be hitting an enemy directly and then continuing to hold the trigger so that the cluster missiles, they'll sort of flare out as they cluster, but then come back in to hit the same enemy. And I think that would create a really satisfying single target effect where we can achieve pretty strong AoE and pretty strong single target entirely through clustering. And of course, you could still cluster sort of mid-flight. You can just hold reload, but still be holding the trigger, and the clustered missiles will still follow where it goes. And of course, I don't think that's automatically a better way of using it, because that's going to decrease by quite a bit sort of the coverage that you have AoE wise. You're going to be covering much less ground, hitting far less enemies. It's going to be more of a single target option, and I think it would be a really satisfying and cool one. I apologise that I don't have really anything to sort of represent this, but I honestly couldn't really think of anything. You'll just have to imagine all the missiles sort of coming together after being clustered and just following your crosshair. crosshair around, or more specifically, picture hitting a Praetorian directly with missile, and then like they all flare out like the sludge pump projectiles, but then they come back in as they come back in on the enemy that you're looking at. I think it would just be really fun, really satisfying, really powerful, but not necessarily overpowered, because we are retaining all of the things that sort of keep cluster charges in check, and really adding even more as well by nerfing the direct damage and direct area damage. I think that's really important, because even though we're kind of we're literally buffing the Overclock purely through mechanical changes, we are definitely buffing it. The impact clustering and the guided clusters are definitely going to make this thing stronger, so you really need to keep it in check. But I think it will take cluster charges to a point where it doesn't... I appreciate the fact that Season 5, they took the approach with the Overclocks to make them very sort of gun feel changing Overclocks. I think that makes a lot of sense, but I think some of them run the risk of making them feel like they're not really part of the weapon. Cluster charges almost just feels like this thing's been added on. It almost didn't make sense. Like, cluster explosives would make far more sense to put on a weapon like the PGL. But if we do it this way, it's going to feel much more like a part of the Hurricane. I think far too often Hurricane Overclocks turn off the guidance. I think you have that Rocket Barrage, which is ridiculous. Rocket Barrage should not turn off the guidance specifically. If it didn't, I wouldn't even be talking about this. But Rocket Barrage does, Monday System does, Jet Fuel Homebrew basically does, because of how fast the missiles move and how much they don't turn. Like, the speed is increased by a lot, and the turning is nerfed. And of course, Salvo Module, the Salvo doesn't follow your crosshair either, and it probably shouldn't, because that's kind of what this is going to do. So that would be a dangerous game as well, but I think there's too many things that basically turn off the guidance, and I don't think cluster charges needs to be one of them. I think cluster charges could be really interesting if it retains that aspect of the Hurricane, even through the clustering, because what we have as it stands is an Overclock that basically changes the projectiles that you shoot entirely by adding this sort of hold reload to cluster mechanic, and even then they really don't feel like part of the weapon, because you just kind of cluster and then they just kind of fall wherever. And projectiles falling is definitely not the Hurricane's thing, so I think being able to guide them as well as just let them fall would make cluster charges feel so much more intrinsic to the Hurricane, and not like it could just be a part of any other weapon like the PGL or the Thunderhead. So yeah, get with it. I'm right. As usual. Anyway, that being said, I think that covers Gunner, so it's time to move on to, well, someone else's main, and the crazy scout-killing bastard that is, of course, Driller.
Things about to go boom!
People would still probably know that Driller is, like, very much so not my main. In fact, I don't like Driller that much. Comparatively speaking, okay? Yeah. And what that means is, well, you look at the dichotomy of barrel vision. The fact that I am an engineer main who most dislikes Driller, and, well, my other half, and this is a purely platonic relationship, is a Driller main who really doesn't like engineer. And yeah, I think I can give myself an equal pass for the other two classes. Certainly not going to bring Tom onto the scout one. Fucking hell. But I think when it comes to Driller, it only makes sense that we bring in some help, outside help. I really should have tried to get Axis on the scout section. That would have been really cool.
Yeah, I'm not outside help. I'm not a special guest. I'm just help for guests.
Yeah, you are. For this, you are.
I'm the co-owner of the channel. I'm not a special that I'm
You're
here.
A special guest. Yeah. It's unheard of.
I'm a special
Your appearances on the channel are so few and far between. I thought it would be good to bring you in once again. So, Driller in Season 5. I mean, look. The thing about this is, Tyler knows Driller well, but I don't... You know, you haven't played that much still. He's Overclocked.
The Season 5 Driller Overclocks are still, like... I haven't played quite a few of the others, but Driller's ones I have dabbled in.
Yeah. Yeah. I assume you do have a stance on them, like individually. It's like, oh, I like this one, or I don't.
If you want me to, do you want me to just blanket at the beginning all three? Like,
sure.
Or you want to wait until we get to each?
No, you can do that.
Because I think Flamethrowers is the best.
Yeah.
I think it gave Flamethrower exactly what it needed. to balance it out. It's really nice, really strong. Cryo, fuck cryo. Can we swear? Is swearing fine? I'm assuming you swear all the time.
What the fuck is wrong with you? Of course we can't swear.
Yeah. Please do not say shit or fuck. Yeah. The cryo, I'm not a fan at all. I dislike sticky flames on the flamethrower, and they were like, you know what? Let's just put it on the cryo because we didn't have a better idea, because they never really ever had for the cryo cannon. Let's be honest.
We'll get to it. We'll get to it, but I think there's actually obviously the crystal nucleation is a much more elaborate thing than that, because I don't love it, but there's like things to say. But combustive goo mix, I mean,
I would say there is nothing wrong with it, but I was definitely hoping for more for the sludge pump. Like,
I'm gonna have to just deconstruct that fully when the time comes, because there definitely is a lot wrong with it.
All right.
Not in a way that I necessarily find offensive. Anyway, so without further ado, I really am. I'm doing things that I like. This is like a start of the video. It's like, let's jump in. It's like, kind of.
We've jumped in twice now.
I do that. We also have to do things like, so we have Scorching Tide, of course, and Scorching Tide, and this is how I do the clips, by the way. Using Scorching Tide usually goes a little bit like this.
We got a big horde of enemy.
Oh, that was amazing footage right there, wasn't it, of Scorching Tide in action? Wasn't it brilliant, Tyler? Wasn't it brilliant?
I can only assume that the editing on that is going to be wildly, like, drastic. You're going to cut, like, the end of your words and the beginning of words, like, often. I doubt you have perfected that.
It's surprising. Now, yeah, that's true, but it's surprising how... And the coolest thing about recording this is I've already fully edited, like, 3 other sections of this video. So I know how this goes. It's actually really nice how Clipchamp works, which I just realised I've really outed myself by saying that. That's Microsoft's built-in editing software, and it's actually really precise. It's surprisingly flexible, though. That's what it is.
All right. Well, I'm surprised you don't give yourself a little bit more time to put the clip in, like an actual gap. If anything, there was less of a gap than a normal, like, speaking words.
No, there wasn't. Well, oftentimes there is, but I found that I just end up cutting out the space anyway. It's not. I don't need the space really. Except right. I do when what happens is when I split the video is that when it fades into the footage, there's like a little bit of the audio that comes after that's like accidentally shows up like before it fully transitions into the gameplay clip. Whatever, the point is, and then we do a little statement on how the Overclock is. Scorching Tide is awesome. Isn't it awesome? It's great.
It is pretty awesome. It's a lot of awe.
Yeah, it's also like basically a clean. Because like I think people do misunderstand sometimes though the nature of these kind of unstable overclocks. Like Scorching Tide is literally a clean. Everything associated with like the negatives is like that's just the charge shot like
using
working.
The charge mode.
Yeah, it's just like so it really shouldn't be counted as negatives, but that's not how unstables really work. I think you can't have this be a clean because it's an inherently unstable change. It doesn't matter that it's not really there's no real downsides. It's still like crazy. I think that's actually how this kind of works, and why there are some that don't seem like they should be unstables, but they are. We will still, however, be making it a clean at one point in this.
Of course.
But that's neither here nor there. We're going to start with, if I'm not mistaken, a nerf. Now, I should have probably introduced you to the 4 categories, to be honest, of changes.
I think when you were skimming through, there was like nerf, buff, rework, and tweak.
Yep, that's right. There you go. I don't have to go through them myself. So this is a basic Scorching Tide nerf suggested by Mega. I don't know. We got lots of viewer suggestions on certain matters, and I believe they only suggested to nerf the sticky flame stuff. But basically, why the hell would you nerf Scorching Tide? You probably wouldn't. Basically, you probably wouldn't nerf it, but I figured that it leaves the rest of the weapon so intact that it makes it probably a bit more flexible than it needs to be. It's like, I have this extreme powerful effect, and everything else is like completely fully operational, you know? And I think the sticky flames are the biggest part of that. I want to reject sticky flames, if possible. Obviously, this is plain in the sense that it's a nerf, but really it could entail like making it slightly stronger itself. But either way, I think it's like one of those things where it makes it clear what the point of the overclock is a bit more, which isn't my favourite kind of nerf. It's really the only nerfs I've done are that, basically. There's like 2 nerfs this whole video. It's like 2.
Yeah, I really don't think it would even change much, because ultimately you are putting it on for this additional benefit. Like, if you need the flamethrower to be better at something else, then you put on something else. But if you don't really give a crap and you just want to be able to absolutely delete Praetorian with your main weapon, you know, this is it.
Yeah.
Right.
And you'll also notice the category change as well, because what the nerfs also do is make it clear that it's not a clean in disguise, and I think that's something that can be said for balanced overclocks. Balanced overclocks don't usually get that accusation thrown at them, because they have downsides to balance out the powerful effect that you gain. Where it's like, when it's unstable, it's just like, oh, the downsides are just the fact that the effect, you know, has some kind of cost involved with it. That's obvious. But to balance it out, you would actually see other statistical penalties. So this is more like, if Scorching Tide were to get a nerf, this is the ideal, almost, you know? That's kind of an approach I've taken. I think that applies to the other nerf, which is obviously later on. I really have to I struggle with that, because obviously I've recorded what comes after this. So there was like there was like a specific thing that I did in both the Scout and the Driller section that is quite significant. And when I came across it in the Scout section, I treated it as if it was like the first instance of it happening. It's like, look at this surprise, and I had to be like, oh wait, you've already seen that. Just haven't recorded it yet. It's very strange.
New to the whole hodgepodge YouTube editing thing.
Yeah, I want to remain new to it after this, I think. Anyway,
This is taking more out of you than you thought.
Yeah, now we've got a straight up buff, and we're changing the category again, because this is really just taking the fact that people kind of see it as a clean and being like, well, you're right, basically. It doesn't remove the ammo cost. As you can see, I've actually put that in there, because that's not a penalty, let's be honest. It's just not. That's just how the overclock works. The movement speed penalty, however, is more of one, I think, for sure. That's quite damning, actually, and is a slightly troubling aspect of it. And if they were to take to heart the fact that people call it a clean overclock, and do something like this, it would make sense to remove that part. But this is not my preferred version of making it a nicer overclock to use, however. So I'd be happy to move on, unless you entirely reject the idea of making it a clean. Because it doesn't really make sense.
Nothing changed, except it's slightly better because you don't get slowed down. I'm not going to argue with that.
Yeah, but I think this immediately gets better with the next version, which is just a basic tweak to. So we're keeping it the same, back to formula. Unstable. In this case, it's actually removed both the movement speed penalty and the need to hold the reload button to charge it. You just press it. It doesn't instantly fire. It still charges up, which I think is fair. Although we could debate actually removing that part of it. But what instead you get is an actual penalty, which is you can't reload anymore. And I think to gain how much better, I don't think people realize how much better Scorching Tide would be if you could just press the button and it fires, even if it's still to charge up. The fact that you don't have to holding it is the worst part, right? I feel like we probably agree on that. Like having to hold it while you aim, you know, or keep your aim on what you want to hit with it, you know. But if you just press it, then it kind of removes the aspect of needing to like hold the target, or at least it's much easier to, because you're not holding a button while aiming, because you're not.
Sure, but it would feel really weird if you press the button and then you sit there for like the same amount of time it would take as it's just charging up. Like there's no real Like, sure, you don't have to hold the button for that time, but you're still waiting all the same, right?
Well, then,
and now
so given that I am making it so you
can't
can't
reload
reload,
until the magazine is empty, which, to be honest with you, would be nightmarish. There is a reason why that does not not a single thing exists with that on it, because like how bad that would feel to play is probably would be like game breaking. Like people would actually throw a fit about how terrible that is.
but if you're just using Scorching Tide, then it doesn't really matter. It's basically like you get 3 shots and then you just have to reload because hopefully you're just using Scorching Tide.
Say that you shoot a single tick worth of ammo just normally, then you got 2 shots and then like 24 ammo you need to spend until you can reload again, which you just have to spray and hope that you don't have to reload at that
fire
time.
Because the way it works, you can still use a charged shot with 1 ammo. That's how it's always worked with these things. So it wouldn't matter. Well, then maybe making it fire instantly is something worth considering. I think that would be kind of insane. But it is how Ice Spear and Snowball work though. You do press the button and then they take a moment to shoot.
Yeah, and they don't feel great.
No, that's true. That's true.
Yeah,
So this is why Tyler was here, by the way. This is something because obviously.
Yeah, I can only assume what other bullshit he's pulled throughout this video. Apologies. This is what happened when he left unkempt.
Yeah. Well, speaking of being left unkempt, but I think I take this next one really as your responsibility, to be honest.
Okay.
You can see why.
My baby.
So this is where I do reworks that are also renames of it because they are so drastic.
This is just Overclock Workshop resurrected.
Well, look at the screen, Tyler.
Yeah, I know, but I can only assume you've been doing it with the other ones as well.
What do you mean the other ones?
Tell me, Harry, or is this you've done reworks for other ones, right? The other stuff.
You mean outside of the new ones?
No, I mean outside of Driller.
Yes.
You've done reworks for Has Turret Guy came up?
No, Turret Guy has not come up. However, I did give blistering necrosis to the stubby. But I did explain to you before we started the point of the reworks is that they're not exactly the point of the video. These are just more so fun ideas, but they still do represent an evolution of the core idea of the overclock. So before we actually talk about all of that stuff on screen, just look at that for a moment. Right, let me just go back. So Raven Retribution is based on a really fucking old idea that Tyler had. I don't actually remember what it did because this is not like
that old.
It's really old. I don't remember what it did, and it's not meant to do exactly that. This is still Scorching Tide, but like dissected and turned into something else. And that is also another part of the reworks, is that sometimes, especially when they're renamed ones, I am partially suggesting a new overclock as well, in a sense. And just to help, well actually I'll explain sort of the mechanics here first. It's basically taking the shotgun spread and making it a gradual thing that you can build up, which means you can fire less than the maximum amount of projectiles. I've also reduced the maximum to 5 instead of 8, so you go like on a stage of charging, like 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. You could change that to 1, 3, and 5 potentially if we want to simplify things a little bit. I think that would be fair. But basically, and you just have to hold reload a little bit to make that happen, like for it to be 1 projectile. But these projectiles cost 5 ammo each, so that's sort of split up for the amount that Scorching Tide normally uses. And it's basically like this. And that was the volcano rifle from RoboQuest you just saw, which is a weapon that just fires fireballs, but there is also an affix in the game. I've explained affixes already, I'm pretty sure, but I've used multiple other RoboQuest clips. And it has an affix called Fork, or Can Do, where it's like every couple shots it shoots 3 projectiles, and that's just to help you visualize what it's going to look like when it fires more than 1 but less than the maximum. And where I think I'm getting away with this balance-wise is the fact that you can easily kill like multiple grunts with a single projectile, but you can do that with 5 flamethrower ammo if you're really good. Let's be honest. Especially if you're using sticky flames or something. So putting that juice into a sort of dissected up version of Scorching Tide, where it's more of like basically a fireball rifle with like a charged shotgun effect. First of all, that'd be a good weapon, you know, for Rokor by itself. But as a complete dissection of Scorching Tide, it sounds kind of neat and looks kind of neat when I picture it in my head alongside the volcano rifle footage. But of course, it is a deconstruction. It's still got the bare essentials of what Scorching Tide does, but it is deconstructed and not really reconstructed either, you know?
Yeah.
Sort of just brought down. But I think it's really cool. It's a bit like on the coil gun, you have controlled magnetic flow, which is like where you can fire it at like lower amounts of ammo cost. You know, it's like 3 stages.
Yeah.
It basically works like that for Scorching Tide. And I hope you can at least see how that, and I'm talking to you a little bit now, more specifically than just the audience, how that makes more sense on this one than it would for like the other charge things like Snowball, because we have like multiple projectiles. That's where I think it kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like charging up the amount that you shoot, you know? It's kind of cool.
Yeah.
And make it weirdly flexible, because you can shotgun a massive enemy, or you can just shoot a single one through like a line of grunts, you know, and probably kill most of them.
It is basically like you wouldn't use the gun normally, right? Like, especially with the -5 damage, -5 heat, like the base gun is basically worthless in comparison to fireballing.
I also wanted that.
It's not the worst thing in the world.
Well, yeah, if we were to take Raven Retribution as the overclock, I think it would, more so than what Scorching Tide is at the moment, it would need to be like discouraged to use it in other ways. You know, it's like, this is how you use this weapon, because a lot of the Season 5 overclocks are completely changing like the gun feel of a lot of the weapons, like burst fire, you know, and how they operate. And Scorching Tide, making one that is adding one of these like, sort of charge attacks into that kind of overclock as well, that just completely changes how you use the weapon, could also be really fun. Because as it stands, as fun as Scorching Tide is, and as like good of a place it has, it is still kind of standing on the shoulders of the cryo cannon already having these. It's not, the actual implementation isn't different. It's obviously just different in that it's like, you're not going to copy and paste the effect. It doesn't just shoot one big fireball, you know. It's like a shotgun spread. It's cool that it is a different thing, but it's still mechanically the same as Snowball. So,
it's just a lot. It's just very lucky that the flamethrower needed what the cryo had in that mechanic, like a burst damage option. Meanwhile, the cryo really didn't need what the flamethrower had, which is basically what they did. They just like switched over mechanics.
It kind of makes you realise how close the flamethrower is actually to being like really great. It's really just held back at this point by the direct damage aspect still being lackluster, and that's kind of been usurped by something that doesn't use those stats. You know, it's direct damage, but it's not
if
using
Face Melt to like actually did something.
If Face Melt was like really strong, you wouldn't actually need Scorching Tide. Technically, it would just be there as like a fun option. But yeah,
like I think honestly, the best thing to do Face Melt to completely gut like everything that isn't direct damage, like genuinely gut it, remove sticky flames, like
you
basically
can't make it
negate
deal no
all
heat. Yeah, but very little. Certainly
very little. Like that's not the point. But then just have it so like the point of it is basically a flamethrower, which is as simple as it gets. It just kills things with a fire. Like if it was that strong and did that exact thing, I think the flamethrower would be in a brilliant place.
Well, yeah, because Face Melter increases flow rate as well, which is actually a downside because it sort of makes you worse at inflicting heat, especially with heat radiance. That's not the point. The point is, there is a chance I will be doing those videos at some point, which is all the other ones. That is not something that I will burden Tyler with, except when it comes to the driller ones, because so far I actually think this is working out quite well. But we're actually at the stage now where we can move on to and I guess a lesser overclock, certainly in your eyes, which is of course crystal nucleation. Let's just roll the footage.
need to hear freaking off. Feel my wrath. You buck down.
Whoa, was amazing. And yeah, I am leaving much less room than normal.
It's just excited.
But if I were to put this down to an essence, it would be strong. Maybe I should have put an asterisk though, because I know why you don't like this, but I also you do need to face the fact that it is very, very powerful, unfortunately. And the things I don't like about it are the same reasons that you don't like it as well. They're the same, because it is sticky flames, but sticky flames is really strong, you know.
Yep.
So naturally, crystal nucleation is as well, and I do think it has some more. I actually do think it has an edge over sticky flames. Where it doesn't is, of course, it's coming afterwards and just feels like an afterthought that was spawned from the fact like, oh, we should just copy this onto this because we did something similar for Scorching Tide. If you divorce it from that quite frustrating like conception of it that feels kind of honestly a little bit lazy, it's actually very good execution, because it has like the interesting mechanics of how you have to like you replenish the trails themselves, so you don't always have to build new ones necessarily, and like how it interacts with the modifications as well. It actually gives some credence to like the damage upgrades, or the damage upgrade, which is actually a valid way of using it beyond just like freezing power. So it's a very powerful overclock, but I've kind of already explained it. But what's the issue of crystal nucleation, Tyler?
Sticky flames.
Yeah, and what is sticky flames?
Just shooting the floor. It's just shooting the floor. It's like I'd rather be shooting a bug, but now I'm shooting a floor.
Yeah. Yeah.
But to me, I think it is a little bit more than that. Like the cryo cannon really kind of needed an overclock, which somehow escaped the black hole of just freezing, right? Which I know this like tries to, and I guess if the damage is viable, then it kind of does. But like the cryo cannon, all its main purpose is to freeze things, and therefore everything that is competing for that, there's a victor, right? That there is just just something that is the best at doing that, and ultimately it's not even an overclock. It is like the ice radiance. I don't actually remember the specific word.
That's fine. Cold radiance. It's the same thing. You're not.
Yeah, cold radiance.
You're not confusing.
Like, ultimately, that is the best way of freezing something, and then you just kind of overclocks tend to play along with it, which makes everything else bad unless it does it in a better way. Like Snowball is actually not that bad.
Well, Snowball's not bad, but it still kind of lacks what it kind of.
It's got like the best range.
I think Snowball is meant to be paired with Fragile actually, because you freeze shit with the Snowball and then like tear them apart with Fragile. But I think crystal nucleation, it is definitely meant to be a thing where you freeze enemies through this rather than cold radiance. And it does work for that. Unfortunately, it's not that fun of a playstyle, really, is it? You know.
And really,
there is the aspect of this entire thing got improved with the wave cooker, right? I feel that sticky flames got improved by the wave cooker because you just can do that thing. Yeah. You know,
being able to throw this down and then switch to the wave cooker, wait for them to freeze, and you don't have to keep switching with this kind of playstyle, right? Sticky flames and now crystal nucleation. You make the floor do the temperature for you, and then you just hold your secondary weapon and waiting to do that thing that you're gonna do, like with
It also adds damage over time. It basically does just kill grunts over time from like one sort of instance of them getting caught in it, you know, and that's also very powerful. And so that's the point. This is like literally an A tier overclock strength, maybe even an S, but it needs to be a bit more fun. And that's why I've taken the approach of the overclocks of not trying to like tweak it into being in a better place. I've immediately gone off the deep end with this one.
All right.
Starting with a straightforward tweak, and I think I'm going to immediately go through. Yeah, this is the Aokiji one. So This is. I wonder if you can recall what the idea was. That you had many moons
My
ago.
one was, ironically, I'm pretty sure if I remember correctly, it was Sticky Flames reminiscent. That's the thing.
But that
It's
was the
just that
point, because
I
we
wanted them to invert
foresaw this future, though. I think that's why.
Yeah.
And you wanted to get ahead of
We
the
kind of-
curve with a version of that
Yeah.
that was actually cool.
We were like, all right, fine. Sticky Flame shoots the floor, but since basically the cryo cannon, they reverse everything. Like, instead of burning, it's ice and stuff like that. I thought, you know what, shoot
Instead
the
of
air
floor,
and create
yeah.
an icy mist that freezes and like falls down. So it'd also then be like Sticky Flames, but for Mactera kind of play style. Like you would just be able to laden the air with frost.
So
and
yeah.
I assume is that.
So this
Similar?
is crystal nucleation, but with something just added on. So it still does exactly what it does, but the effect that crystal nucleation is of creating these crystals can also happen in other places. So one of them is the crystal gets formed at the end of the stream. So like that would be the mid-air thing. But also, you could still get it mid-air because, and this is the more important part, I think the mid-air thing could probably be dropped because it would look really weird.
It wouldn't make much sense.
No,
Yeah.
but the one I really like is forming ice crystals on the enemies themselves. And that means that the enemy you literally are inflicting a damage over time effect, but more specifically, you're giving that enemy thorns. Because obviously, cold propagation isn't a thing, like how fire spreads throughout enemies,
Yeah.
It doesn't do that. But this would do that a little bit for like the enemies that you afflict with it. Like you place an ice crystal on them, and obviously it would decrease over time and you could replenish it, but this would be like a way to kill Mactera over time with the cryo cannon. But also anything else. And you could even get rid of you could even completely transform this into like not even crystal nucleation. It could literally just be something that makes it so enemies form ice crystals when you shoot them, as like thorns. You could really go in a lot of different directions with it, but I think the core of the idea is having the crystals be able to be formed in other places. Like you're not limited to just hitting the ground, and we could keep the air part. We don't have to, but I think having them be able to be formed on enemies themselves sounds like I don't know, a lot of fun. And that's why I think it makes sense to nerf the damage for that though as well, because you actually don't necessarily want to be doing like killing things that quickly either with the direct stream if you're going to be forming crystals on them. And it's certainly for like you'll want to pick out like the stronger enemy, like the guard in the grunt horde, to form the crystals on, and then it will sort of just be like this spiky tank that's just hurting its friends. But I think that would be just a lot of fun. Maybe you could even like put them on Steve, I don't know.
You just keep freezing, but yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's just an interesting evolution of crystal nucleation. Like it almost makes sense because of what the concept is, that it forms these ice crystals on the ground. So
On like anything it touches.
on anything
right?
it touches.
And it's like,
yeah.
and that includes creatures.
Yeah. And that's it really.
Yeah.
It's not. I don't have a clip for this one. I do for the next one. It's ridiculous.
All right.
But the next
I
one
think we
is.
should get to
I
that
think
one
it's
then.
an extension even further because this one's actually a rework. I don't remember what this does. I just remembered. So it's basically the same, except that you can basically build the trails upwards. Trails form on top of each other as well. This is why it's a rework, and I'm totally not going to include a clip from Scooby-Doo 2 Monsters Unleashed here for fear of copyright. Anyway, so just imagine that, and so I think there's a couple ideas here that we could
what's his name
dissect.
from The Incredibles? Did work too, right?
Frozone. Yeah, I probably shouldn't include a clip of Frozone either, because that might get us in trouble as well. Anyway, so I do want to dissect it a bit because I think there are some ideas here that make sense. It's literally like, look. The core of the idea is, who the hell doesn't want to be able to create ice structures with their cryo cannon, right? That's kind of it. It's basically like people always suggest like the platform gun idea, right? Of like it being like a weird cement sprayer, and they can build stuff like by painting. I want that, but for the cryo cannon. And so you would basically create like bridges of ice that the enemies would walk on and just slowly get frozen and killed by. And you could even use it as a traversal tool for yourself. Which is why I don't know how you feel about the fact that it doesn't hurt you. Maybe it should hurt players as well if you can climb all over them and use them in that way.
Well, it would start melting like quickly. I assume.
Yeah, it would be
How long
like
do they last?
maybe walking on it would damage it, like how like that kind of happens with crystal nucleation anyway, where enemies do damage to crystals when they walk on them. So we don't necessarily need dwarves to be hurt, but like you will like they'll quickly disappear. But this also is like kind of built into the Max Terra thing, because you can literally just like find a tunnel and just spiral until it like creates a wall of ice, you know, in the tunnel. And I think that's pretty amazing. Overpowered, yeah, but also it's not like you can do much to them. If you create a wall of ice, they're just going to be rubbing up against it until they die or break through. You can't shoot through it yourself, you know, so you'll be actually creating fairly static gameplay by doing that. That's kind of just stalling or gradually killing enemies.
Not picturing this right. The crystals are the same size as they are in the game, right? So they're going to be these thin beams of like ice.
Yeah,
So
but I imagine it's quite easy to
out of that.
build up, though. Probably, maybe it is more. Maybe it is quite a bit more. I don't know.
If you wanted to block off a cave, that's probably like at least 80 ammo, maybe more.
Yeah.
That's like build a wall.
Yeah. So what's the, I guess there is the idea of the best way to achieve something like that, because I think most people agree that would be a really fun thing to be able to do with the cryo cannon. Is like do something like that. But maybe that would actually be a more interesting extension or rework for something like Snowball, where basically it's like the platform gun, you know, but for ice. But obviously, you'd want them to probably be vertical, though. You know, like, so it creates like a big... Or just creates a big fucking ice cube or something like that. You know? I don't know.
Yeah, I feel like there is like so many like interesting things you could do with the cryo cannon, you know, like ice in general. But it feels like they've never really been able to tap into that potential. They just keep finding different ways to apply the freeze status effect.
Well, yeah, this is why I took the approach I did, though, with these, because it's like... I don't think I can really make crystal nucleation better through simple like number tweaks. So I thought I'm just going to take an approach of throwing some fun stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks. Like having ice crystal stick to enemies. Because otherwise, I think it's actually a really fair idea. And obviously you'd have to nerf it a little bit, but I think, you know, you're not looking for direct damage with it anyway. So the damage nerf, I think, made sense.
No, but you would like spray the front line and then start slowing down as they get frozen, fall back, and then that starts freezing the entire like enemy thing. And then they kind of just like all freeze from the inside, and you just like eat them up. Which I guess technically you can do by just shooting the floor, but it's like, I don't know, it's a little less interesting. Yeah.
It's actually a little bit like that the wildfire thing that I came up with, where like it was full of flamethrower. It literally just made it so that the enemies would radiate heat more effectively themselves, and they would like drop sticky flames when they die as well, or things like that. Yeah, there's definitely more that can be done with it, but obviously I didn't want to go off the rails either, because as soon as we go any further than this, obviously this is kind of insane, but as soon as you go further, you're just going to be like creating things that aren't even crystal nucleation. And this isn't an overclock workshop. I'm here to change and modulate. I'm not here to create. Anyway, luckily that one's a bit shorter, because I mean, we talked about needing to keep ourselves in check a little bit. We're brushing up against it.
Oh, close.
Yeah.
Oh wow.
But what I did when I did the scout one, that comes after this. That feels so weird. Is where I had a lot to get through. Like the GK2 had like I think the most things on it. Startup's got quite a few as well. So we kind of need to basically lightning round it a little bit. Combustive Remix. This is everything that it does. Obviously, this is a much more elaborate version. And if you don't know what it does, watch this. boom, it's overkill. That's the biggest problem with combustive goo mix. It's overkill and really niche to achieve that effect anyway. You know, it's like, you don't really need it because when it comes to taking out hordes of enemies, the Sud Funk just does it anyway, you know? So it's like, I don't need these explosions to finish off the grunts. And it's like, it's okay against single targets. It's actually not bad at all, but the way you achieve it is still just far too niche. It's like, oh, I have to use the EPC with this specific tier 5 upgrade. Sick, you know? And I think they think that makes sense because of how strong it is, but like I've already established, it's somewhat overkill, which makes it really hard to justify. So with combustive goo mix, I've taken the approach of both making the overkill aspect make more sense, and then also sort of making it so that it's no longer overkill or it's something else, because I really think removing that the niche build aspect of it is important.
Is that bottom one real? It like unburns them. They blow up.
Yeah, so I don't know if that's the first change. Let's have a look. No, it's not. Okay, we'll get to that. I'll explain it because there's one that removes that, and I'll explain it when we get there. So we're starting with a basic thing, which is turning it into a clean. As you can see, the burning enemies are still down, but it's not counted as a downside. It's just included in the effect. So why is this? Why have I turned it into a clean? I think this is a way to make the overkill aspect make more sense, because I don't really respect the fact that it's forcing you into such a specific build with like your secondary, and it's also like doing anything as far as downsides are concerned. It's like, just make it a clean effect, which makes the abstract nature of it make a lot more sense, you know? I think cleans have the excuse to be niche because they have nothing tying it down, you know?
I don't know why it isn't just the goo naturally explodes and you can speed it up with fire. I don't know why it felt like such a strong urge to it. Okay, good.
We'll get to that. But this is basically making it like exactly what it is, except taking off like anything that ties it down, which is literally just the increased charge shot cost. Because it's just like, if you're going to take this, you're forcing yourself into such a, like, you're backing yourself in such a corner build-wise anyway. So you might as well make it a clean. But I want to immediately jump into making it better, really, especially in my opinion. So this is a buff. It's exactly the same, except you can read the description there, and you can understand what I'm doing. Do you want to read it?
Yeah. Food, enemies, and puddles explode when ignited or detonated.
No, the subtext, not that.
Oh, well, you just said read it. Well, yeah, dousing mechanic removed because it's fucking stupid.
Okay, so the dousing mechanic is basically the, well, obviously how it works is you can ignite goo puddles to make them explode, but you can also ignite a gooed enemy to make them explode. What they changed after it came out is that they made it so that if you do the second thing, where you ignite a gooed enemy, they don't stay on fire after the explosion. It just removes the fire. And what you could do before is, like, usually you do it the other way around, actually. You usually set them on fire first and then just shoot loads of goo at them, and it would create a bunch of explosions every time the goo hits them. And that was actually really fun and strong, and made, like, the nicheness of how you have to build the overclock feel, like, justified, basically. It's like, yep, this feels like the right amount of strength for, like, being pigeonholed into using the EPC, and having, like, more expensive charge shots. So it made sense, and I think literally an okay thing to do the combustive goo. I want to do more of it than this, but if it just comes down to reverting this change, it would still gain a lot, basically, just by doubling back on this change. Because, look, sometimes Ghost Ship make decisions that do seem a little bit anti-fun. On the whole, they're so not that, you know? But there are a couple times, like this, and, what's that other one? I'm wondering if you actually know, because it's a very specific one. The most anti-fun thing they probably did. Come on, you know it.
I am aimless.
Well, you do know. Don't worry. It's to do with drilling Rockpox enemies.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's like they were like, no, we didn't want you to be doing that. Stop! and then made Rockbox enemies unbearable for like everyone.
Occasionally, it's like their guard falls and they forget that 90% of what they've done is like more so for the purpose of fun than balance. It's like,
Yeah.
So I think doubling back in this change would still be a positive, but maybe we need to get even more elaborate than that. Forgot it was called that.
Dude, grow up. You're a grown ass man.
No, I'm
You're
not.
naming an overclock. Splooge yourself.
Shut up. So this is what you just mentioned. So this is a version of it actually keeps the exact same penalties, but what this does, it does change it quite a bit. This makes it so that goo puddles naturally explode, and you will notice the amount of damage. First of all, play the barrage infector clip. And so that basically helps you visualize what I'm thinking. Where obviously that's easy to visualize because it's like the barrage infector basically shoots like it's sludge blast, you know, not like a single thing that clusters out. But either way, it shoots a bunch of projectiles that land and then explode after a certain amount of time. So just picture the sludge pump doing that. And you can also ignite them, and that will make the explosion slightly stronger and inflict heat as well. And the second point though, that's the one that could potentially be dropped, which is when it comes to like enemies themselves and setting them on fire and gooing them. I'm not sure about keeping that. I just think it's a really neat thing. But goo puddles themselves exploding naturally.
It should just be. Yeah, I think it should just be that, you know, an enemy on fire is heating up puddles and will therefore blow it up, right? Like, I think it should be puddles only. It's probably a good way to go about it.
Yeah. So we could. That's it's all you know up for debate and it's all subject to change.
Made up bullshit.
It's all made up.
Go anywhere.
Yeah. Well, that's if I fully believed that, I probably wouldn't have made the video. Because as we all know, Anders wants to make at least one change to burst fire. Anyway, so let's quickly talk about why I made the explosion so strong, though. 120 damage is enough to kill a grunt on full health anyway, but the reason why I think that works is because the Surge effect does that anyway. And, you know, there is a hidden penalty here, which is obviously, it actually halves the duration of puddles. So you have to keep that in mind as well. They normally last for 12 seconds. In this case, they only last for 6. But it's still going to be overall dealing more damage.
Would the mods extend the time, or would they not do anything?
I think, let's just say, the way I would want it to work is that if you took the mods to increase the duration, it would still be like half of whatever you make it. So I think it goes up to 16? Then it would be 8 seconds, I suppose.
Okay.
But obviously, the further penalty there is, you know, once the explosion happens, the effect no longer carries on. You don't have the damage over time, you don't have the slowdown, but you have likely killed whatever it is. I think this would kill guards really effectively as well. And obviously, if you're using it right, when it comes to single target enemies, you'll actually be aiming at the floor that they're about to walk into. So there would actually be an interesting aspect of timing. Unlike with how it is normally, where you kind of just shoot it anywhere, and then either wait for the enemy to walk over it, or you just shoot so much goo, you know, that there's no way they can avoid the explosions. In this case, you probably wouldn't want to just shoot it everywhere, because they might just go off without hitting anything. So I think it would also be a much more interesting way of using it as well. Just a lot more engaging and freeing, obviously, because you still have the option to ignite, but it's not baked into its DNA, which means you can actually use a different secondary. So I think that's actually important for helping it have some identity.
Like, I don't mind some things, like, well, because it's just, this is so very specific, really, isn't it? It's like, it's not just using the EPC, it is specifically using a single mod in the EPC, right? You have to use that mod. I mean, it's just so, like, I mean, it's like, sure, if you're using the EPC, there's like a good 50% chance you're already using that mod, right? Because you're not going to be using the splash one, so it's either one or the other.
That's not even the important part though. It's just because what's important about you saying that is if you're using the EPC, you're probably using that anyway. But if you're not using the EPC, you're using one of the other two weapons, which have a lot more options. You're actually more likely to be using different tier 5, so you're locking off a lot of other builds, you know? Like if you use EPC with this, you're going to use the fire on it. But if you use another one of the weapons, you could use anything, really. You could use...
Yeah, this isn't like a new concept for especially Driller, right? Like having things tied to other stuff. Like, I guess obviously, I mean, volatile bullets on the Bulldog was like pretty heavily tied to minigun.
Yeah, at the time, that was like burning hell only.
Technically, yeah, I mean, you technically had the grenade still, so you didn't have to use the minigun. But I think it was still, you know, a bad example. Not bad, a good example, but it's like it wasn't exactly the greatest thing.
No, well, anyway, I think the principle still applied to that. I think that's just improved over time, and I do think the dichotomy of Gunner's weapons works for that, where Gunner is very specifically like main weapon and sidearm, you know, his sort of layout, and the Driller is a bit different, where it's more like main weapon and then like combo weapon. So it's not a sidearm. The two operate in tandem, you know. Unlike Gunner, where they're usually just like, you'll use the secondary to finish it off or pick off like really weak enemies and things like that. And volatile bullets is like an exception, you know? Unlike Driller's primaries. It's also, it would actually be somewhat interesting because you wouldn't necessarily use all the same stuff that you would normally use. You wouldn't inherently want to use Neurocorrosive Catalyst on the Sabata because you don't actually have as much time to use the effects, you know? So you might want to just go down another route, go through like
the amount of explosions that would occur.
The amount of explosions
would be pretty fun.
Well, that's why I'd probably if I use Wave Cooker, I'd probably go for Boiler Ray or something.
Maybe.
Yeah, not necessarily just like the poison or the gamma stuff. I don't know. So yeah, you could do that. Or alternatively,
time to kill women. You know they're gonna die like when everything blows up.
Alternatively, you could just do this.
Oh.
This is the secret. This is the secret sinister thing. The sinister third thing, or fourth. This is the sinister fourth overclock category. This is
the tier 5.
Yeah. No, actually, the other example of this isn't a tier 5, and I'll show you that after we're done. So this basically makes it so that Combustive Goo Mix is now an upgrade that you can just take in tier 5, and I think this works first of all because I think the Sludge Pump's tier 5 isn't that important. It's like increased slowdown or increased damage over time, and they're good, but if you want the effects of Combustive Goo Mix,
this is damage,
it's better.
Burst damage, right?
Yeah.
It's
if you want to use this and you're willing to use the EPC, like you're willing to go down that specific route, it's definitely better than the other options if you're willing to like use the specific build. And I think having the specific build,
especially
it is more
with,
of a
the puddle one, the overclock.
Exactly.
With the overclocks, it can really like extend this.
That's the best thing about changing it, because you know I'm still keeping the fact that it limits you to using like fire specifically, so you have to find that somehow. But by having it be a tier 5, there is still inherently more build diversity because you can use any overclock you want with it. You know, like Goo Bomber Special would be amazing with this.
I was thinking that.
Think about that. Yeah. Or obviously Dispersive Compound. You know, those two would be really fun with Combustive Goo Mix if you did that. And it's like it's so much less alien to have like upgrades have more specific uses, especially on Driller. You know, Driller is littered with tier 5 upgrades, mainly in secondaries that rely on taking a specific primary weapon. You know, so it's actually that's fully justified. It's just not as justified in the overclock category. So I think this makes a lot more sense than it seems like it does. You know, you can immediately have like an incendiary reaction, which is like, "What are you doing? You can't make it an upgrade." It's like, that's why I put that at the bottom there. Seriously, just think about it for a second. You know, just think about it.
Yeah,
and you'll see where I'm coming from.
Does work quite well.
And I know that we'll lose an overclock for the Sludge Pump, but look, overclocks are cool, but some weapons do transcend them a little bit. Where the Sludge Pump, it could have got something really cool, but it's at this level where it does have everything that it needs at the same time. So but the way that can actually get something good out of combustive goo mix, they tried to add something that they thought was going to be unique and sort of worth using, and they didn't completely fail, but it would actually gain more out of it being an upgrade. And I think that's interesting and worth considering, because I don't think that's the case for most of them, or even close to most of the overclocks, I think most of them should be overclocks, but this is an example where the weapon will genuinely gain a lot more out of it. And I really do want to tell you what the other one is, so because you'll understand, but that's why we need to basically get rid of Tyler so I can move on to the scout section of the video. Any last words?
Love driller, hate engineer, simple as.
What about scout?
I don't mind scout.
Alright, anyway, here's the scout section.
From A to D, skipping B and C.
Okay, so scout, we got to this point, the last section of the video. I'm hoping that what preceded this was a section that was performed, let's say, by not just me, and that's why I'm actually recording the scout section after the driller section, or opposite of that, before. Of course, it comes forth, but what comes first is driller, and that should be, well, let's say we should have a special guest. I hope so. I don't know if I'm going to cut this out if he doesn't. Anyway, the point is, Scout, as far as Season 5 goes, I think Scout, he might have done, he definitely didn't do the worst. I think that's impossible to say because of conductive thermals, and because I think the ideas for the other two are just so strong. It's literally a weird, inverse, where you have Burst Fire and Mark for Death, which are amazing concepts with mixed execution, and then you have Conductive Thermals, which is just an extremely mixed and obscure and, on paper kind of bad idea that has impeccable exceptional execution beyond what people thought it was going to be capable of. Anyway, the point is, Scout's in an interesting place with Season 5. I think he got some really interesting options, and that even includes Burst Fire, which obviously doesn't come off as that interesting. And that means, of course, we have to talk about Burst Fire. So, yeah, you can quote me on that. Take a look at this. So obviously Burst Fire is, well, needed is the best way I think to describe Burst Fire, because I'm sure a lot of you probably know that the response to this Overclock has been relatively mixed, in that it's probably just not strong enough. It's arguably a nerf, or rather at least it's the Burst Fire aspect is a penalty to allow for the increased damage and stun chance, and I think that makes sense to an extent, because it kind of just makes it so that the GK2 is competing with what the M1000 does, and even then, the problem with Burst Fire is it's competing with literally every other overclock on the weapon aside from Electric Reload. And I want to apologise now, because I think this is probably going to be the most substantial section of the video, which is why I'm actually going to try and tighten it up a little bit. I'm going to try and go a bit quicker, because some of these are fairly incremental or iterative, and I don't have any reference footage for any of it, so you just have to imagine everything I'm going to be talking about. But Burst Fire is in a very strange spot. It's the one thing that I know Anders, one of the game designers at Ghost Ship, wants to make a change to. I think it's going to be something quite significant if he manages to make it happen. But until then, I want to throw my hat in the ring with quite a few different ideas. This first one is a buff that combines an idea that both me and, well, Mr. Cheese 8097 had. And his idea was simply adding more damage, and I think that is actually perfectly acceptable. By adding +4 damage, it allows us to get this this breakpoint that is mentioned below, but that is only allowed by my idea, which is actually the ability to increase the burst size. And I have a theory that this is actually what Anders might want to do, because basically how GK2, why would I say GK2 instead of burst fire? How burst fire works with its magazine bonus is that it increases by an amount that fits the burst, so it increases it at base, it increases it by just 3, so it goes from 30 to 33. But if you take the magazine size upgrade, it goes from 40 without the overclock to 45 with it, and that is obviously just to allow for the number to be divisible by the number of the burst. But I think, and while obviously 45 is divisible by 3, it's also very obviously divisible by 5 as well. So I had the idea that what if taking burst fire meant that if you take the magazine size modification, it actually increases the burst size to 5. And now this is dangerous, because already the burst fire sort of main criticism is the fact that it basically tanks your ammo, essentially. It cuts your ammo in 3. This is going to divide your ammo by 5, okay? And I understand that, but that's because this GK2, especially with the even more damage that we're getting, is a... Also, I just realised I removed the stun chance on this version. I think that's a good idea. I think this is still overall buff. But the reason why I think I can get away with a 5-round burst is because this GK2 is a single target killer. It is an M1000, but it's the GK2. It's the M1000 if you want to use a different weapon, basically. And of course, as you can see below, if you take all of these upgrades, so that will be, I think that's damage and damage. Well, it's damage and magazine size to get it to 5 rounds, and armor breaking. It means you can one-shot a grunt anywhere, basically, which, as we discussed, is of course the most important breakpoint in the game, so I think it would make it worthwhile. I think if you're going to buff burst fire without changing it mechanically, although of course there is kind of a mechanical change here, but if you're going to buff it while keeping it as burst fire, I think this is the way to go. And I also think that the stun chance associated with burst fire is an unnecessary tapped on kind of thing. I don't think it's doing that much good. But this is going to do a lot more good. Like, I really do think the stun chance is tacked on. It wouldn't be if it was actually achieved where you have an auto stun if the full burst hits an enemy. For some reason, Ghost Ship refuses to do that, and that is something I am going to be defying later on. But for now, I think we have a more middling tweak here, which actually increases the stun chance and stun duration. This is suggested by Mega I Don't Know and Snoo61755, who I think both suggested that playing up the crowd control, or more so the stun aspect of burst fire, would perhaps make a bit more sense. Making a stunner kind of overclock, I think, is actually a really good idea. It leans into Scout not always having crowd control, as your secondary will likely be single target anyway, because that's kind of how Scout works, and especially with the state we're in now, you can make a very effective single target secondary weapon with Scout. But it will allow you to disable and pick off high value targets with amazing efficiency, like basically turn off Trijaws, Acid Spitters, Web Spitters, even Menaces and things like that. Stingtails, if you take armor breaking, which you probably should. Septic Spreaders, it's just going to be turning them off basically, and probably killing them very quickly as well. You will have noticed though, we actually have decreased the damage bonus by 1, and I think that's appropriate if we're actually going to be making burst fire a very strong stun overclock. This is still in keeping though with Ghost Ship's stance that they don't want you to be rewarded for hitting a full burst. I still think that's dumb. I think most people do, and I don't mind saying that. I don't mind saying this is something I genuinely believe Ghost Ship are wrong about. But this is still in keeping with that. Of course, we need to move on if we want to change that properly, and I think we're about to, because this is the one. There we go. So this is another tweak. It's actually completely the same, I believe. Except we don't have a damage increase. The damage increase has been swapped for an explosion that occurs on an enemy when you hit them with the entire burst. I think the explosion is pretty much exactly the same as the one on Smart Rifle's explosive chemical rounds. However, it doesn't have the fear effect built into it. And that's because we're actually retaining the stun chance. And I think giving the GK2 AoE crowd control and clearing at the same time would probably be a little bit too potent. But I think this also leans into the aspect of burst fire that we really need to talk about, which I mentioned earlier, in the fact that it competes with every other overclock on the GK2 except for Electric Reload. And Electric Reload is definitely a crowd clearer and a crowd controller, but in a more niche manner. And it's also very much so a HGT killer as well, and sort of a combo overclock. It's used for setting things up as well to get damage bonuses from the Zukovs or the Bolt Shark. It's a very abstract and flexible overclock, unlike the rest of them, which are all single target, and burst fire is no different. Burst fire is just another single target overclock, and I think if we want burst fire to stand on its own, that needs to change. Of course, at its core, burst fire, all it's really meant to do is take this assault rifle and make it a burst rifle. So in its own concept, it really shouldn't be an AoE overclock. But like I just said, if we want it to stand on its own, it needs to do something that the others aren't doing. And you might say, oh, well, it's making it into a burst weapon. That's true. That is something that the other overclocks don't do. But just like all those other overclocks, it improves its single target damage instead of doing anything else. So having it be able to cause an explosion, and it's not really a reward so much as it's so the way you're meant to use the overclock. And that's why we're taking away the direct damage bonus as well, because basically it means you have to hit with a full burst to utilise what the overclock is really offering. And that creates a more interesting dynamic as far as ammo economy and the role the weapon plays in your arsenal as well. I think this makes a lot of sense. And we actually have a pretty similar thing that's coming up next, which I think is actually a rework, but it's still balanced. Now, this rework is called Crowd Control, and it is based on an old idea I had, which was basically, it would make the GK2 pierce enemies and also lay, like when it hits the ground, it would spawn a fear minelet. Of course, we have minelets in a couple forms, mainly just the cryo ones, and then of course the mine layer system version on the Hurricane. This version would have just produced fear mines, which is a little bit abstract. I think they actually would have been like pulses. They wouldn't have even done damage, I'm pretty sure. Either way, this of course is still burst fire, but it's just been turned into something else. It's also adding blow through, which is going to add a kind of weird, kind of abstract AoE aspect. But the reason why I want to do something like this, where obviously we also have the same thing where you hit an enemy with an entire burst to cause a fear effect, and this is actually going to be quite similar to the fear effect that explosive chemical rounds explosions cause. So we're kind of splitting explosive chemical rounds up into two separate ideas. But where I think I'm getting away with this is that blow through and fear are both things that the GK2 doesn't have, and adding them together would create a highly valuable package where the burst is almost a downside that you take for the bonus of having these other effects. And I think it is important to note, like I just said, that blow through and fear are both things that the GK2 doesn't have. So bundling them into one overclock makes burst fire, or in this case crowd control, a much more valuable pick, and actually competitive with the others because it's offering something that is not available in the base weapon or in any of the other overclocks. So also thanks to Snoo61755 for also suggesting the fear aspect. So good going there. The next one is, well, we're just going to get weirder and weirder. We've got two more to go, and they really do just get weirder and weirder. So it's another rework. It's called Matchstick, and this is going to be a category increase. It's also based on another old idea, not one that you can find on the channel. It's based on an old idea I had for a new weapon. And I think the idea is actually for it to be a driller secondary, where he would have like a clockwork like rifle. It would shoot in 5-round bursts, and on like if the full burst hit, it would set the enemy on fire like automatically or something. We're doing something quite similar. We're still adapting the 3 or 5 burst idea from the first change, and I'm really happy about that. But we do have this really abstract heat aspect as well, where it inflicts an amount of heat that is relative to the amount of bullets that hit the enemy, but you still have to hit them with the entire burst. This means that because it's 30 heat per bullet, it's going to be 90 or 150 based on whether you have a burst size of 3 or 5. In exchange, we do have the same kind of stuff, so obviously the magazine size stays the same as non-burst fire, and so does the rate of fire, but we are actually going to lose max ammo, I think that's appropriate here, and lose damage, because this is going to be a way of achieving really abstract single target damage, and it is designed to be a robot killer, and also to hit really specific breakpoints to create uber efficient temperature shock combos. It is definitely meant to be comboed with the Bolt Shark and the Zukov's cryo options, and of course the cryo grenade itself, whether you set them on fire first and then use the cryo, or the other way around. If you hit one grunt with a burst, it's dead. You hit a spitball with a 5-round burst, it's probably most of its health, so come back to it later. Cave leeches go down in one hit. Praetorian gets set on fire with a 5-round burst. Patrol bots with 3 rounds or 2 5-round bursts. It would just be an insanely satisfying way to handle a lot of specific threats. So it wouldn't inherently be good at taking out bosses, and it wouldn't inherently be good at taking out crowds, but it would be amazing at just picking off anything, pretty much, except the tankiest of enemies and the biggest of crowds. And I think that's actually a really interesting role for it to play, because that is so often what players are seeking from Scout, to be honest. It's this really high burst damage against these sort of weaker but important targets, and just having it basically just reward you for hitting a full burst with just this massive heat burst. I think it's a perfect way to achieve that, and would also just be insanely satisfying as well. I think it would be really cool. So I hope something like this is actually considered, and more so, I think maybe finds its way onto something else. It could still be the GK2, but this could easily be its own overclock, or maybe something else that could doesn't have a burst option that could. Maybe the stubby, and it gets a 5-round burst and it can inflict fire. I don't know. I do think it's a really cool idea. What's even cooler is this one. Now, this is that special category that I mentioned. This is the burst fire rework, but it's not going to get turned into anything else, name-wise, but it's getting turned into a modification instead. So, actually, I think the way that I've done this is that this actually comes up earlier. So I apologise for the weirdness of this structure, but this actually came up with combustive goo mix, didn't it? But what we're basically doing here is making burst fire an upgrade, like how it is for the Sabata, the 2-round burst in the Sabata. What this is going to do is enhance build diversity as opposed to limiting it. I've already explained how burst fire is competing with all the other single target overclocks, and I think we just achieve a much more healthy selection of overclocks where burst fire is actually there as an option to take with all of them, rather than nullifying them. It's like, oh, you either take burst fire or you ignore all these options. It would also be really fun with even just electric reload. You probably wouldn't use it with that, but honestly, it could still be interesting. I just think it makes more sense, and it's just a lot healthier and will be appreciated for, instead of forcing you to not use those other options, it is there to enhance them instead. So it's still exactly the same in what the burst is doing, so we gain a 3-round burst, but this technically converts the weapon into a burst weapon, so it has a slower rate of fire between bursts, so between shots, I guess, but of course the burst rate of fire is still 20 per second, so that doesn't change. It is exactly the same, except it's just not an overclock, really. And this will be in the tier 3 slot, which I do apologise, but I think I need to check what that slot is to really get my point across accurately. But I hope this makes some level of sense. This is tier 3, which is alongside recoil and magazine size. So the reason why that works is because of, well, the magazine size, first of all, you could technically fuck it up a little bit by taking an overclock that tweaks it, but if you don't, it's just going to stay at the base 30 magazine size, so it fits within that pretty nicely. And there's also recoil, but I think you would basically tweak it so that the burst fire would still be fairly accurate and not have loads of recoil. So you wouldn't feel like you have to take recoil, but obviously you wouldn't be able to take both of them. I know this is kind of wild, but I think the logic is actually very sound. And I think it would also make way for possibly a more interesting overclock for this GK2. I don't know what that would be, because it is quite a simplistic weapon in its nature, and has been throughout its entire existence, of course, of getting overclocks and sort of tweaks to its upgrades. It's never really had anything that interesting aside from electric reload, but we could make room, and I think the weapon would still benefit and become a lot more interesting if it gained burst fire as an upgrade instead. Anyway, so that's GK2. That is burst fire. And finally we can get onto the last bunch and some of the shorter ones as well. Starting with Marked for Death. So Marked for Death, it usually goes a little bit like this. So my stance on Mark for Death is that it is basically just hopeful. And what I mean by that is it is quite good, but it's clearly not quite where it needs to be either. It's really strong and it allows for some really fun sort of examples of just obliterating enemies, but I think mechanically it's not quite as sound as I would like. And I'm going to immediately jump in with my first suggestion, which is a pretty direct and very simple buff, which is going to be inverting the focus shot ammo cost penalty and actually making it so it reduces the focus shot ammo cost. I think this would be a really simple way to alleviate pretty much all the problems with Mark for Death. So this means that now your focus shots will only cost 1 ammo, and I think this makes sense because I kind of see Mark for Death as like it's shooting a different projectile anyway when you use a focus shot, and this is going to come up later, by the way, in more full. But I really do just think that the focus shot cost increase is an unnecessary penalty, as you're already using that shot purely to set up sequential hip fire anyway, really. I know that's a bit of a solo biased perspective, but that's kind of how it ends up getting used anyway. And it also would allow the more ammo version, because I found from my experience that taking more damage instead of ammo is actually really bad with Marked for Death, because you are often using another weapon, is what I found. And I know it almost doesn't make sense, but what it means is that if you take more ammo, you have the leeway to use your other weapons and the M1000 itself, yet it almost feels like when you have less ammo, even though you have more damage, it almost makes more sense to not use more M1000 ammo because you want to save those mark shots. But if they costed only 1 ammo, then you would feel much more justified in just lasering down enemies with the M1000 with increased damage. So I think this actually makes a lot of sense. I think it would downplay any arguable weaknesses that the Overclock has, and I do think it has some. And obviously it is an unstable Overclock in the sense that it's not really making the weapon weaker, but it is changing how it works enough where there are sort of playstyle pitfalls that I think would be alleviated by buffing it in such a manner. Anyway, can't quite remember what comes next. Oh, okay, here we go. It's coming up again. A rework for Mark for Death, which is called Tracking Darts. So this is going to really take advantage of sort of concepts that have been introduced over the last few years, starting with the Bolt Shark, the addition of alternate ammo pools. We know we can have separate ammo pools because of that, and so which means it's not out of the question, first of all, and it really would create a more interesting ammo economy and allow focus shots to take advantage of the effects of the overclock. So basically what's going to happen here is you will hold, as it says, you will hold reload to fire a tracking dart from a separate ammo pool that will be displayed by your ammo counter, similar to how the quick chill charges are displayed for Rotary Overdrive. And you'll carry 12 by default or 16 if you take increased ammo on the M1000. If this was in the game, hypothetically, those numbers would probably have to be tweaked. I acknowledge that, because we also have this aspect of tracking darts having to be, or they can be retrieved as well if they happen to miss their targets. They do work like Bolt Shark bolts, which obviously means that I am partially suggesting this could be a better overclock for the Bolt Shark. That's neither here nor there, because they also do have low velocity like a crossbow bolt. Anyway, but what this achieves is mainly help. It is actually very, very solo biased once again, and so is the next one. In fact, this is actually the changes that I'm proposing for Mark for Death come entirely from my really biased perspective. And I've already explained that at the beginning of the video, but I think it's worth reiterating because I think it's more present here than in a lot of the other parts of the video. Because what this will allow you to do is actually use the focus shots with the effect. You know, use the focus shots against marked enemies, and I think that's actually really important. Because that's something you can't normally do, because of course it converts your focus shots into the tracking dart that you would fire. If we're not doing that, you can now use the focus shot against Dreadnought and probably deal a lot of damage. And that's really just there as like a prize, because frankly you're definitely going to have better DPS by just shooting. Of course, if you take the increased focus shot bonus damage, you will deal more damage with the amount of ammo that you use by doing this. But your DPS will still be better if you just use hip fire shots. So it's really just up to you. But I want to move on because I think the next one is actually a lot better. So this apparently is a tweak, which almost doesn't make sense because it's quite an extreme change. But so Yeah, it's definitely also a buff, by the way. I want to acknowledge that. It is quite a substantial buff. I'm not sure why I called it a tweak. This is a straight up buff. It's actually kind of crazy. It's a tweak because, now, based on previous examples, this really should be a buff because overall it's definitely a buff, but it's a tweak because we lose the focus shot charge increase. In fact, I'm not going to change it now, but I reckon that it would actually make a bit more sense for it to be to have a focus shot charge speed penalty, in fact, because this is going to make the focus shots, the marking effect on the focus shots, much more effective and give it a lot more longevity as well. Not technically time-wise, as you can see, but basically what we're doing here is... Actually, hold on. Roll the clip. So, what was that? That was another RoboQuest clip, of course, and this is using the effect called Mark. Very similar to Mark for Death, of course, where you mark enemies with certain effects. This is achieved through a lot of means in the game, but some classes, the Ranger and the Recon class, they have this perk that you can get that basically makes it so that mark effects spread to nearby enemies when the marked enemy is killed. Now, I believe this transcends the duration of the effect in RoboQuest, so it sort of just keeps getting refreshed. We're not doing that here. The mark effect will be spread to a nearby enemy, say within 10 meters, but its duration will stay the same. It will be 8 seconds overall. I think when it comes to a mini boss, or I think it applies to bosses as well, I think it will either stay at 4 seconds or turn into 8 seconds depending on what it hits next. But basically this means, and this is why, by the way, I increased the bonus damage that it causes to ×2, because what it means is that you can just obliterate grunts, because you can mark one and then it'll be one-shotted by a hip-fire shot, and then it will spread to another, and you can one-shot that with another hip-fire shot, and keep going, do as many as you can within the 8 seconds. You can definitely do more than you have in a magazine as well, because you'll take Killing Machine in Tier 5 and just go to town. And I hope you can see what the idea is here. Grunt Hordes, things like more niche things like core locks and turret controllers, Mactera Swarms. It's just going to be a beautiful just dance of death, and I really hope the appeal comes through here, because I think this idea is absolutely incredible. I think it would lend so much value to the Mark for Death effect and the concept, and just take it to another level that I think it deserves. I don't think this will be overpowered, mainly because I think a lot of the reasons why certain players take Mark for Death are still, a lot of players using 1000 are still sort of removed by Mark for Death. I think, you know, a lot of people still want to use like electrocuting focus shots for some reason. Not a bad overclock, but I think a lot of the reasons why people use the weapon would still be missing because of the nature of Mark for Death, so I don't think it's going to inherently have an insane pick rate, but I do think it deserves to have this kind of quite crazy level of strength. So picture it if you will, or, you know, replay the footage from RoboQuest. But I really think I'm onto something here, and I hope you agree. Anyway, it's time to move on to, as is customary with Baron Vision, the final weapon. I guess, well, what's customary is actually for it to be the Bolt Shark, I suppose. And it technically will be when we get round to that in 2 years' time. And I obviously Season 6 is less than 2 years away, but the next video might be about 2 years away. The next installment of this, not the next actual video. Unless there is the next video that's like this. Who knows? Anyway, it's time to talk about the Drac, and it's time to talk about conductive thermals. You know this Overclock, but I'm going to show you what it does nevertheless. Bang! So, I think I've got a good word for this that sort of describes how we feel about conductive thermals as a community of players, and that is strongly. Conductive thermals is batshit insane. It is the last thing that anyone expected to be strong, and yet it is fucking incredible. It's really strange that it is as well. I'm not going to try to explain what it does. It just, but in essence, I suppose, it allows you to achieve insane damage with elemental effects. But this can come from a lot of sources. We have fire and ice on a number of Scout secondary weapons, and we have electricity, of course, on the Drak itself and on the Bolt Shark, and we even have Plasma Splash on the Drak. Works wonderfully with this because part of the damage that Plasma Splash deals is fire type damage, so that actually gets buffed by the effect, and it just becomes just this amazing thing that is really self-sufficient but also amazing at buffing the damage you do with your other weapon and also what your teammates can do. It's just a beautiful piece of work, and I think it is superbly strong, and that's why this is one of the only other Overclock that's going to get a nerf. Don't worry, it's not very harsh. All I've done is decrease the damage even further. I think, am I correct in saying that I also decreased the heat with this? Yes, okay, so the heat and the damage penalties have been enhanced with this, but that is the only change. And I think this is fair. First of all, the heat aspect, I think this will make the Overclock a lot more engaging, where you have to actually keep an eye on your heat more, not the Pokemon. And I think that's fair, because I personally find the heat very easy to control, and I think a lot of people do as well. And I think it's worth learning to play around the heat to get such a powerful effect. The damage, however, we basically just don't need it. With how conductive thermals works, you don't need the direct damage. You're probably getting the damage from the Drak itself, you're getting the damage from the electricity or the Plasma Splash, and in general you're probably getting most of your damage from your secondary anyway. So I really do think that decreasing the damage by a lot is actually completely fair. And the reason why I think a nerf is okay in this manner is because, and this is a little bit cheeky, I think if they did this, it would make it far less likely to have its more unique effects nerfed in any way. I think the effects really should stay the same. I think they're at a really comfortable and attractive strength level, and I don't think it's really going to do the Overclock any good to nerf those. But if they do think the Overclock is a little bit too strong, then make it more punishing to use when it comes to the other stats of the Drak. So I think this actually makes sense as a nerf, and so like I said, it's kind of here to as an idea of how to stave off other nerfs. It's a little bit cheeky, but I think it comes from some kind of place of sense. Anyway, let's just up the ante here. I think we've only really got 2 more to go. So we've got a tweak here, which adds, it's not a rework because it's pretty much exactly the same, and it's actually the same as the previous one. I've carried over the nerfs, actually. But what I've added is another idea that I've had for a while, which is did come from conductive thermals, but it was just the idea that conductive thermals would actually inflict its own damage over time effect. Now this is overall a buff. The only reason it's not a buff here is because I've carried over the nerfs from the last idea. But I think there is some sense here. Of course, you can see how it works. It would be literally one damage per second per stack that you inflict on an enemy, with the duration being the same as whatever conductive thermals is at the moment. And I think the only justification I can really put forward for this is that it will make it non-reliant on effects, and I think that's always satisfying when a weapon doesn't have to rely on status effects or rely on comboing with other equipment or even your teammates. And it will open more build diversity as well. Now, I don't think that's necessary, but it would be kind of nice, whereas now you can use this thing with pheromones or explosive chemical bolts or things like that, or not necessarily feel the need to take an incendiary boomstick or cryo, so because you can do something more interesting with it, because you're not necessarily comboing anymore. That's just an idea for elevating the conductive thermals overclock to a more flexible position, but that doesn't actually necessarily align with the way I see overclocks. I think overclocks can justify being very fixed and having very niche and specific builds that work well for them. I think that's actually perfectly fine. So I'm not putting forward this idea as something that I think it really needs. I just think it could be kind of interesting. And actually, what could be more interesting is this being its own overclock. This effect that I'm proposing being entirely its own thing could also be equally interesting. I think the idea of stacking effects is actually really cool, and we do have an example of it in damage over time when it comes to neurocorrosive catalyst on the Sabata that actually does inflict a stacking damage over time effect, and I would love to see more examples of that. Anyway, let's get on to the last thing, and I'm just going to round it out with a real just Hail Mary. So this is another rework. We're bringing it up to unstable. This is the propagator. So the essence of this is that this is conductive thermals for every single status effect in the game. So I apologise first of all for what I'm doing here, but basically I'm just tanking all the stats, so basically deal no damage, especially when it comes to weak points. We have that hefty heat penalty still in place, but we also enhance, basically it increases the damage of anything that deals damage over time, and also sustains any kind of effect over time, even if it doesn't deal damage. And that would include things like stun and fear and pheromones and all of this shit. And it also increases the ammo because... So the ammo increase is because the weapon is being entirely converted, you know? Entirely converted into something that's supposed to buff other things, including itself as well. But, you know, when you're dealing basically no damage, you will notice that even if you're using Plasma Splash or the electric upgrade. So keep that in mind. You're not this absolute god just because you're using something that has over 1,000 ammo. It just turns the Drac into an effect spreading nightmare weapon, and I think that's such an awesome idea. And I hope you do too, because that is pretty much the gist of it. I don't really have a way to exemplify this, which I didn't really think about the fact that I didn't, but you know, whatever. I guess there aren't that many references for this segment. If I go back and look through my like videos that I've collected for, you know, extra footage and find I do actually have something, I'm sure I'll just have to jam it in somewhere. But either way, that does it for Scout. So hopefully you enjoyed this entire thing, and it's time to say goodbye. Hopefully I won't be saying goodbye alone. Let's just do it. All right. It's time to say goodbye. It's time to say thanks. I brought the guest back for the credits.
No, he didn't. He's crazy.
He's still. Who was that? Who was that? Anyway, first of all, thank you. You're just not going to say anything for the rest of it. That'll be really weird. Holy shit, that's acting right there. Anyway, first of all, thank you everyone that genuinely for watching this, if you did. And I want to say, you probably know I didn't start the video off like this, and I don't think I should have done. But this is obviously not the kind of video we normally do. We're pretty much entirely unedited most of the time. So I do want to say that this is not going to be a common thing, and it's actually, I've no idea when there will be another one of these. The only one that I can say for certain would be like post season 6, you know, like to do this again for like the secondary overclocks, assuming that happens. That's the only real guarantee I can give, you know.
How many like views and subscribers would this video need to get for you to feel motivated enough to do them regularly?
Like automatically, it's like I've got to do more.
Yeah.
I think it would have to be 2,000, because that's like
You're the man.
1,000 is like obviously it's not like what we get casually, but we do have that many subscribers. But I want this to be like a significant edge over what we normally do, if to like justify something like that, you know. I will be happy though, obviously, for it to do, you know, for anyone to watch it. And if I do end up doing more regularly, I think it makes sense that it would be more of this series, you know. So that will be focused on rebalancing all of the pre-existing overclocks. And I've thought about this a lot, by the way. This is like my most common thought exercise is doing that, by the way. So I'm very prepared. And the scariest thing is, I think I do have something to say about pretty much every single overclock. But that is obviously an extrapolation based on spending like way too much time with the game. You just end up, you just start going insane, basically, and you know, wanting things that you shouldn't really want. Anyway, this should have come out at the weekend. Obviously, I don't really want to date this, but I think this, if we're going to date it at any point, it's this part of the video that makes the most sense to. The only thing I will say to date it is that it would have come out at some point between season 5 and season 6. But if you are watching it in the moment, like just it's come out and you're interested, Overclock showcases will resume next week, and I mean, I don't know if they're still going on a year from now, but let's just say they are. And finally, I just want to thank
A safe assumption.
everyone. Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know if I told you. I think I have told you. I mean, the intention is, as long as I'm still chucking along. I mean, look, hopefully there will be some kind of transfiguration where Rogue Core will seep its way into that kind of slot in some way. I don't see how it couldn't. Although my desire would be for maybe more regular Rogue Core gameplay stuff with both of us. But I want to do like tier 5 upgrade videos, which is really dumb, but they are basically overclocks in my eyes. And from a gameplay perspective, it will be a lot more interesting for me because it's like I get to use whatever overclocks I want with them. And that, you know, there's been a bit of that in this video with combustive goo mix and burst fire. Because yeah, I can refer to all of them now. Unlike when we just did the driller recording. Anyway, I just want to thank everyone though involved. So this is obviously everyone who's provided ideas. So that's Mega I Don't Know, Snoo 61755, Flapjack RT, Syringe Based Potato, Kingston 42069, whose idea was purely just buff mortar rounds. That's all he said. Mr. Cheese 8097, who we love, Certified Row Butler, Enrico Bolognani, who I really do not think I'm pronouncing your name right, but you're the best because you made those modded overclocks, Seaface, and of course Ghost Ship Games, and if anything more specifically, Mike and Anders and all the programs and game designers responsible for adding overclocks, and of course Sophus Alf and Charles Jorgensen for the music that you've heard throughout the video, and of course thank you to all of our subscribers and viewers and our loyal member Box Fox Scoot. Now that really does date it, but I think you really should thank your members in these kind of videos. And of course, thank you even more so to you, Tyler.
Me?
Yeah, you for
You're welcome, Harry.
I don't know, for creating the channel.
Yeah. Motivation. I think I cheered you on all along the way. Whenever you kept yapping about this video you were making, I was like, okay.
Well,
I think that counts.
Cheered me on, but you were graciously, uncharacteristically passive rather than like trying to drag me down. So
I only drag you down when I can get my fucking hands on you, and you were too busy making hard-working videos and dedicating yourself for me to do that.
Yeah.
So, good on you, Harry.
Yeah.
You did an edited video. What Barrel Vision had never done before.
Well, so I think that's true because I don't think when it's something like I put in like a slide at the beginning, like that says like I'll skip to this point to where we start talking about Deep Rock. That's not an edited video. That's not, you know. No. But this is, and I hope you all liked it. I found the process tiring, but pretty interesting, and so far I'm proud of what I've done because I've edited a lot of this already. But with all that being said, I think it's finally time to leave you all. I don't actually know how long this is going to be in total, but it's not short at all. If I did this in one sitting, I would have lost my voice, straight up. So, you know, I think I deserve some kind of medal for that. You know, some kind of appreciation. But then again, it's what a lot of YouTubers do all the time. So maybe not. Finally getting a taste of what it's like. So respect to everyone out there, and well, I'd say we'll see you soon, but who knows when you're watching this. But just as always, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, then please make sure to like and subscribe. I'm not going to say if you want to see more videos like this, then click the bell. But if you do happen to want to like just keep in touch with Deep Rock Galactic and Rogue Core, then there's a place for you at Barrel Vision. All right, see you later.